Chapter 27-23 Weird Black Crystal Empty God thought he was about to have a stroke. He had been tricked by Bao, which made him so furious that he could barely see straight. He wanted to catch up to the little girl, but Han Sun had already teleported next to her. They were standing together at the base of the tree. Empty God wasn't afraid of Han Sun, but this whole scenario was too embarrassing for him to bear. He had tried to trick a mere child, but he had failed miserably. More than once. He had also lost a true god item, the Stargauge mirror. He started to step toward them, but he knew that he couldn't do anything to Han Senator. He couldn't take the Stargauge mirror back, and Han Sun might even mock him for trying. Wait here. We are not done yet. Empty God growled to himself, staring at the father and daughter. He teleported away, still enraged. When Han Sun heard Bao yelling for him, he was shocked. A place like Star Tree shouldn't have some random person moseying about. Han Sun teleported to Bao, but he didn't see the man she had mentioned. But he did notice that Bao was holding a small bronze mirror in her hands. She was merrily running toward him. Dad, look at this treasure mirror and this gem. A good uncle gave them to me. Bao held out the Stargauge mirror and gem toward Han Sun while she spoke. What good uncle? Han Sun asked, frowning at the two items. I was playing on the star fruit earlier. Bao quickly told the story. After Bao spoke, Han Sun almost laughed out loud. The man she had met must have been Empty God. Han Sun thought Empty God would go for exquisite or liqueur, but he had actually selected Bao. Oh, Empty God. You were unlucky to select Bao. Now you are losing all your treasures. You couldn't get Bao to make a wish, and as you tried, you lost a true god item. Shaking his head at the thought, Han Sun took the Stargauge mirror out of Bao's hands. Gods were allowed to trick people, but they could never lie. If Empty God said that Stargauge mirror was a true god item, then it probably was. Han Sun's mind went to the shield of the Medusa's gaze, which was a true god weapon. This mirror was of the same level, and according to what Bao had said, it would enable him to see the future and the past. Han Sun was so happy about receiving this. The black crystal armor was no longer locking down the power in his body, which meant that Empty God must truly have left the vicinity. So Han Sun cast his Dongxian Sutra to try and make use of the Stargauge mirror. He wanted to see if it was as good as Empty God made it out to be. Although he couldn't completely activate the power of the Stargauge mirror, the Dongxian Sutra was still able to elicit some response from the Stargauge mirror. He tried to use it a few times, but he was ultimately disappointed by the results. Han Sun didn't know if his power was too weak to use the Stargauge mirror effectively, or if the mirror itself had some restrictions. Either way, the future that the Stargauge mirror could display was only a very short scene. Such as, when Han Sun used the Stargauge mirror to see the future, he could only see a scene. The image flashed across the scene, showing Han Sun sleeping and nothing else. And after Han Sun used it that one time, it took him a whole day to recover the power needed to activate the item again. He used it a few times, but the scenes depicting the future turned out to be a pointless waste of time and energy. They were just flashes after all. He didn't learn any useful information, and the power to see the past was just as crappy. The Stargauge mirror allowed a window into the past, but activating that ability cost a great deal of energy. The further back in time you wished to see, the more power it would cost. With Han Sun's current power, he could only see up to 1 minute into the past, and the mirror would only show the area within a meter of his location. Using that ability repeatedly would drain his strength at an alarming rate. Those were the results Han Sun received after rigorous testing. As for the exact rules that govern the use of the Stargauge mirror, Han Sun still hadn't figured them out. Clearly, the Stargauge mirror was too high level for him, just like the shield of the Medusa's gaze. Han Sun's level and power were not enough to unlock the true power of the item, but the mirror's mirror armor was a pleasant surprise. Although Han Sun's power was limited, the mirror armor power didn't require much energy. He activated the new armor while wearing his Apollo set, and he found that the two armors reinforced each other. The armor's defense was as good as a Larvae-class treasure now, but sadly, there was a time limit on the armor. After he activated the ability, Han Sun's armor would only look like a mirror for a few minutes. Once that time elapsed, he would return to normal. Han Sen decided that the short duration of all the mirror's abilities was probably linked to his own lack of power. He just couldn't effectively make use of a true god weapon. Bauer wasn't interested in the star gauge mirror, and she only played with it for a bit before throwing it to Han. Senator Han Sen gladly took it off her hands. The thing would still be useful, and once he became deified, it was bound to be even more useful. After all, the power to look into the past could come incredibly handy once Han Sen became stronger. Is there a way for us to get rid of this troublesome empty god? If he keeps trying to set traps for us, things will turn out very poorly. Han Sen was a bit annoyed by the man, but he couldn't think of a way to deal with him just yet. The gods kept appearing out of nowhere. They could even come and go as they pleased in a place like outer sky. Furthermore, Han Sen didn't have a way to kill such beings. There was nothing he could do. Han Sen expected Empty God to return and torment them some more. But over the next few days, the black crystal armor showed no sign of activity. That meant Empty God hadn't bothered to come back. That surprised Han Sen, but only because he was lacking a key piece of information about gods. They could go to any place in the universe freely, but their bodies had many limitations. They couldn't stay in one place for too long. So, Empty God couldn't just remain in outer sky for as long as he wanted. But Empty God was finding a way to deal with Han Sen and his daughter. He first met them through his search for gene protoplasm, but the frustration they had caused him had almost driven the gene protoplasm from his mind. Han Sen stood by the star tree, holding a black crystal. He looked very weird. The black crystal armor had released its limitations, so Han Sen could take the black crystal out of his sea of soul. Once he had it in his hands again, Han Sen tried to feed the black crystal to another xenogeniac. However, the other creatures that he tested it on didn't react. It was like the black crystal was now useless. And after Han Sen tried putting his power into the black crystal, he realized that his Dongxian Sutra no longer did anything to it. But when he activated the story of genes inside of himself, the black crystal exhibited some strange changes. The black crystal in Han Sen's hand took on the shape of a miniature immortal dragon. Aside from the black color and minute size, it looked exactly like the immortal dragon. Han Sen passed the power of the story of genes into the black crystal, and the crystal rose out of his hand and flew down to the ground. It swelled to become a life-size immortal dragon. The dragon stared straight at Han Sen, just like the first time they saw each other. Han Sen's heart leaped. The immortal dragon's body released a strong, holy light. It covered a wide area around them. There was a scar in the tree's surface nearby, which was probably the result of a bug bite. The damage was healed by the immortal dragon's holy light. Chapter 27-24 Golden-haired monkey. This new black immortal dragon still has a healing power? When Han Sen saw this, he was very happy. The black crystal that had transformed into an immortal dragon could follow commands that Han Sen gave it telepathically. And it had a healing power that was deified class. This new black crystal wasn't exactly what Han Sen thought it would be, and it didn't have the power of his first black crystal. However, the power it had just demonstrated didn't seem too shabby. With this immortal dragon, Han Sen could fight carelessly. He wouldn't have to worry about getting hurt. As long as he didn't die, the immortal dragon could simply heal his body. The strangest thing about it was that the immortal dragon could be reduced to a black crystal. In many ways, it was like a beast soul. He could lob it into his sea of soul for easy storage, which meant he could take it with him wherever he went. Han Sen couldn't wait to fight a deified xenogeniac, so he could give it a try. The idea of fighting while the immortal dragon's immortal area backed him up was very exciting. Bauer had grown quite bored as she lounged comfortably on a star fruit. She spent some time playing with the gem she had gotten from Empty God, but eventually, she put it away. It didn't take long for her to lose interest in it. Right now, Bauer was missing Empty God. He was the only person who had been kind enough to give her so many toys for free. As Han Sen was practicing under the tree, someone teleported to the boundaries of the star tree. Han Sen raised his head and realized that person was Shale. Brother Han. Shale. Han Sen looked surprised to see him. Han Sen hadn't seen Shale since the silkworm bout. He didn't know why Shale would have come all the way to the star tree. I received the leader's permission to come here and collect a star fruit. Shale pulled out a notice to show Han Sr. I see. Please come in. Upon confirming that the notice was legit, Han's son shut down the defenses of the star tree to permit Shale to enter. Han's son felt very uneasy about this though. After the star tree's original guardian left, star fruit was forbidden to be consumed by anyone. But the very high leader had still permitted Shale to come and take fruit. That wasn't normal for sure. Shale wasn't shy or hesitant. He walked right into the star tree zone. Han's son commanded his legion of xenogeneics to not harm the man, and Shale made it safely to the star tree. When Bauer saw Shale, she looked curious. That was because when Empty God had shown her the future using the star gauge mirror, she had seen Shale picking star fruit. With Shale now arriving, her curiosity had been piqued. Shale walked toward the tree in a straight, determined path. He didn't stop or wander around. He seemed to have a pre-selected target. Hansen didn't think this was weird though. If the very high leader had given him such unusual approval to come and claim a fruit from the star tree, then they wouldn't just leave his reward up to chance. He must have a target already. Hansen was curious, so he followed behind Shale. He wanted to see what star fruit Shale was going to collect. A few minutes later, Shale arrived at the star fruit of his choosing. Hansen couldn't see what was so special about this particular star fruit. Shale didn't immediately pick it, however. He turned to face Han's son and told him, "Brother Han, we might have a fight on our hands later. I hope you can protect the star tree and keep it from being harmed." Sure, Hansen nodded. That was his responsibility. But Shale was a primitive deified, and he spoke to Han's son like he wasn't confident in his ability to control whatever it was that lurked inside the fruit. That gave Han's son a bit of a shock. The xenogeneics that came out of the star fruits were always asleep, and there was a secret skill to make a contract with them before they awoke. If the person who opened the fruit didn't want to make a contract with the creature inside, they could kill it while it was still asleep. But Shale, who was a primitive deified, said there would be a fight. That cast this entire fruit opening scenario in a more ominous light. Once Han's son had prepared himself, Shale flew to the top of the star fruit. He knocked the star fruit down from its branch. The whole process thus far was the same as when Han's son had picked his own star fruits. The fruit itself burned away, revealing the xenogeneic inside. The xenogeneic's body wasn't very large. Like Shale, it was an ordinary and muscular creature. It was around 3 meters tall, and it had blonde hair. A golden-haired monkey. Han's son was shocked. That xenogeneic had short legs and long arms. Its head had 3 sets of ears. Each one looked like a snail. It looked very strong, but there was also something strange about the creature. Although Han's son couldn't see any substance chains, he could tell that it had a scary presence. He knew that this 6-eared, golden-haired monkey was deified. It was different from the normal xenogeneics of the star fruits. When this blonde monkey was revealed, its eyes were already open and shining gold. The gold light in its eyes looked like it could outshine the moon and the sun. Upon seeing Shale in front of it, the 6-eared, golden-haired monkey suddenly screamed. Its gold substance chains exploded like a holy light. That powerful radiance wrapped around its entire body, and the creature shot toward Shale like a golden flame. Shale's eyes were unwavering, and he generated a gold substance chain. He didn't fall back. He moved toward the attacking monkey. Their fists hit each other, but the golden-haired monkey didn't move. Shale's body stumbled back a few dozen meters before coming to a stop. Judging from this display of power, Shale was weaker than the monkey. Without a moment of hesitation, the monkey kept moving. It rushed toward Shale with blinding speed. Its body was releasing a scary presence. But Shale didn't seem worried by the creature's power. He moved with almost casual elegance, and he shook the pursuit of the 6-eared monkey. He fought the monkey not by matching its power, but by utilizing his own prodigious skills. Although Shale was very talented, he had been raised poorly. When Han's son had first fought him, Shale hadn't known many top-class genoarts. In the time since they had last seen each other, Shale's fist skills had improved. He also had a few more top-class genoarts. He had gained a lot of strength, and he was obviously a much more capable fighter now than he had been during the silkworm fights. He really did eat a demon fruit, and earn a fake 11 armor talent. His improved speed is way too fast. Han Sen complimented him. But after watching this battle for a while, Han Sen's brow furrowed. The super powerful Shale was being suppressed by the six-eared monkey. As he watched the fight, Han Sen could tell that the six-eared monkey was a primitive deified. Its speed and power were better than Shale's fake 11 armor talent, however. Plus, the six-eared monkey's power was very strange. Shale would occasionally find an opening to land a blow on the monkey with one of his scary Geno arts. But after he attacked, the monkey's shadow was the only thing that would remain. The six-eared monkey's real body would appear elsewhere. It would then send a dangerous strike back toward Shale. Shale stayed calm and managed to avoid losing his head each time, but the monkey's attacks left cuts across his body. He was bleeding continually now, and he looked terrible. Chapter 27-25 Cocky Noobs. This golden-haired monkey is very powerful. It can suppress Shale, who is at the same level as it. The xenogeneics that come out of the star fruits are really special. Han Sen looked at the creature with interest. A powerful elite like that gave Han Sen a lot of inspiration. The most special thing about it was the ability of the monkey to clone itself. Not even Han Sen could tell when the monkey was using its true self or its copy during the battle. The real monkey and the fakes were far too difficult to distinguish. Anyone who wasn't careful would certainly end up falling for its tricks. But Han Sen was hesitating, trying to decide if he should help Shale. Eventually, a very high man approached him. Han Sen jerked slightly in surprise when he saw the man. He hadn't noticed when the very high man arrived next to him. Li Chunxiu. Han Sen recognized the man upon seeing his face. Li Chunxiu was very famous amongst the very high. He was the elder brother of Exquisite and the others. He was very talented, and no one in the very high could match him. Not even Li Kier, who had a 10 armor talent. Li Chunxiu watched Shale and the monkey doing battle, and he said, "Do not help him. He must experience this fight himself." When Han Sen heard those words, he relaxed. Evidently, he didn't need to bother helping Shale. Shale was at a disadvantage, but he wasn't too injured to continue fighting just yet. He was still holding his own against the six-eared monkey, and as time went by, Shale began to take fewer and fewer wounds. Li Chunxiu had just been standing there quietly watching the fight, but he suddenly said, "What do you think of Shale's recent improvements?" Han Sen looked around. He was the only person nearby. Clearly, Li Chunxiu had to be talking to him. But Li Chunxiu was still watching the fight, and he hadn't looked at Han Sen while he asked the question. He has improved very quickly. It makes sense that he has an 11 armor talent, Han Sen said. And it was truthful mostly. Shale's improvements did impress him. Li Chunxiu didn't move. As he watched the battle unfold, he said, "This blonde monkey is an ancient xenogeneic called the six-eared macaque. Its genes are very strong, and it is born with a 10 armor talent. And its flesh is so powerful. Its mind is very tricky to discern. It is always hard to tell whether you're looking at the real monkey or another fake. It is hard to find an enemy like this at the same level. Even Shale, who is a born deified, cannot beat the six-eared macaque easily. With Brother Shale's power, he simply needs a little time. He will beat the six-eared macaque eventually," Han Sen said. Li Chunxiu nodded and said, "I'm not worried about that. The six-eared macaque is a small task for Shale. Taking it down won't be very difficult." Speaking of that, Li Chunxiu finally turned to look at Han Senator. He said, "Actually, the only person that can be considered a serious obstacle to Shale is you." "You must be joking, sir. I'm just a half-deified. I don't have what it would take to impede Shale's growth." Han Sen wasn't going to accept some random compliment to boost his ego. Li Chunxiu didn't reply to that. He went on to say, "I'm in charge of the very high's good fortune pool. If you need to, I can let you visit it." "What does that mean?" Han Sen asked, struggling to follow the conversation. Li Chunxiu jumped around a lot when he spoke. He had just been describing Han Sen as Shale's biggest impediment, and now he was telling Han Sen that he could go to the very high's good fortune pool. Opportunities to enter the very high's good fortune pool weren't granted to everyone. Han Sen had heard about the pool before he even came to the very high. Even Exquisite and Li Kier had never received approval to enter it. Therefore, Han Sen hadn't yet had a chance to go there. Now Li Chunxiu was offering him the opportunity to go. It was confusing. Li Chunxiu knew what Han Sen was thinking, so he coldly said, "You have become Shale's demon. If he cannot beat you for real, it will be an impediment to his growth and ascension. He might lose the chance to become a true god. So, I hope you can become deified soon. Then, Shale will have a chance to defeat the demon that ravages his soul." Li Chunxiu seemed to think that even if Han Sen became deified, Shale could probably beat him. But Han Sen didn't mind that. Han Sen was used to other people being arrogant around him. Where was the harm in letting someone else be a bit cocky? "If you are really making this offer, then thank you very much, sir. When can I go to the very high's good fortune pool? If you don't mind me asking." Han Sen wanted to pin this down as quickly as he could. After all, Han Sen still had another 2 Geno arts he needed to raise to half deified. Maybe he could use the very high's good fortune pool to break through with them. The good fortune pool of the very high was quite mysterious. It could increase the potency of one's genes and blood exponentially. Han Sen had wanted to go there for some time, and now this was his chance. "Take this good fortune spell. After today, you can go whenever." Li Chunxiu handed Han Sen a small spell. Han Sen accepted the spell, and he noticed that the object was only 2 fingers in width. It looked crystal clear, and it said good fortune on it in an ancient language. "Thank you, sir. I'm going to try to become deified, so that Brother Shale can put his demons to sleep." Han Sen put the good fortune spell in his chest pocket. Then, he smiled at Li Chunxiu. Inside, however, he was thinking, the very high really are quite rich. He is just randomly giving permission for someone to enter the good fortune pool. And in a way, he gave it to an enemy. Li Chunxiu glanced at Han Sen with interest, and he said, "You are a really interesting character. If it wasn't for Shale and Yu Shanshin, I would say you were the most interesting silkworm in this generation." Li Chunxiu's words seemed to indicate that he thought Han Sen was weaker than Shale and Yu Shanshin. Within that generation of silkworms, he was only number 3. Han Sen was in no mood to argue though. In a way, he was quite happy. As the two of them talked, Shale had become more and more stable. The 6-eared macaque no longer had the advantage, and it was on the verge of being suppressed by Shale. Its real and fake bodies were no longer confusing Shale. Han Sen had to admit that Shale was a genius. In a short amount of time, he had been able to study the 6-eared macaque. Han Sen suddenly thought of a question about the 6-eared macaque. He looked at Li Chunxiu and asked, "Mister, how did you know which star fruit held the 6-eared macaque?" Exquisite, and Li Kier told him that the xenogeneics inside a star fruit couldn't be guessed from the outside. But Li Chunxiu and Shale obviously knew what to expect from the fruit they had chosen. They knew it would be the 6-eared macaque. "The very high sense can grant a useful predictive ability," Li Chunxiu answered. "I spent some time looking over this tree thoroughly, and after much deliberation, I came to the realization of where this creature lay. Plus, this star fruit was born strangely. It was easy for me to guess what was inside." Born strangely? Han Sen tilted his head to the side as he looked at Li Chunxiu. When this fruit was formed, a weird gold shadow fell over the star tree. I wasn't too far away from the star tree when I saw this strange scene. Based on what I saw, it wasn't difficult for me to determine what xenogeneic might have been found in that fruit, Li Chunxiu said levelly. Chapter 27-26 Real and Fake Bodies. Pang. Shale's punch struck the 6-eared macaque solidly and sent the creature's body soaring through the sky. He hit the real body. Han Sen instantly refocused on the fight. The 6-eared macaque had managed to escape using its fake body this time. Shale's blow had landed on the real monkey. Shale chased after the flying monkey, like he was part of its shadow. His punches were like a river, bursting its banks to flood over the 6-eared macaque. The creature's body started to crack, and deified blood poured everywhere. No matter how many movement skills it used or fake bodies it summoned, the creature continued to lose ground. It no longer had the power to battle Shale's mighty fists. Under the continuous stream of hits, the powerful 6-eared macaque was badly injured. It squealed as many fissures and wounds appeared across its body. But the 6-eared macaque's body was so strong, And as of yet, Shale hadn't managed to inflict any serious injuries. Only its skin was being injured. Ha! Shale suddenly stopped attacking. He wanted to give the six-eared macaque a chance to retreat and compose itself. Shale watched it from afar, giving it a moment to breathe. He slowly waved his fists and shouted. After Shale's shout, the space around him shone with a striking power that looked like the sun. Countless gleams of that striking power flooded out of Shale. It was like a meteor shower ceaselessly raining down on the six-eared macaque, and each gleam exploded on contact like a nuke. Boom! The scary explosions almost destroyed everything. Under the never-ending attacks of that scary power, the six-eared macaque's body was unable to hold up. The creature's godly body was slowly being torn apart. Han Sen watched the display in amazement. Shale's punch was rather similar to his own under-the-sky knife skills. The punch Shale had just cast was summoning power that had been previously dispersed. The attack wasn't exactly like Under the Sky, however. It was only similar. This is the sea's return to the stream. It is very similar to your Under the Sky knife skills. Do you think Shale performs it well? Li Chunxiu asked calmly. He is very strong, Han Sen confessed honestly. In such a short amount of time, Shale had become very proficient with such a challenging Geno art. It meant he was very strong. Shale had lacked knowledge in Geno arts in the past, but the Very High had been kind enough to fix those flaws. The more Geno arts that Shale learned, the scarier he would become. It would be just like leveling up again. I hope you become deified soon. Don't make Shale wait too long, Li Chunxiu said. Shale walked over to them, carrying the six-eared macaque over his shoulder. He nodded to Han Sen and turned to leave with Li Chunxiu. Han Sen didn't concern himself with the two of them. He happily held the good fortune spell inside. It would be great if the universe had more people like Li Chunxiu in it. I have made too many enemies here. But for some reason, I don't need to find resources myself now. I will have an endless amount. Han Sen was preparing to leave when he suddenly felt something wrong. His heart told him he was in danger. The next second, Han Sen teleported away. Just a shadow struck the spot he had been standing a moment before. Han Sen leaned forward to get a better look at the shadow, and what he saw gave him a shock. It was a monkey that was half the size of a human in height. Its head had 6 ears, with each one looking like a snail. Golden fur covered the being. It looked like the six-eared macaque, but it was much smaller than the first six-eared macaque. Earlier, Han Sen had watched Shale defeat the six-eared macaque. The man had even dragged the creature's body away with him. And now, there was a smaller one right here. That was unexpected. Was that prior six-eared macaque a mother monkey? Did it have a baby that Shale didn't see? Han Sen murmured to himself, looking at the smaller six-eared macaque. Han Sen couldn't think of any other explanations for why a miniature six-eared macaque had appeared before him. But the xenogeneics inside the star fruit had no chance of getting pregnant. Therefore, his theory didn't make sense. You are a mother monkey. You all are mother monkeys. This is my real body. What they took away was just one of my fake bodies. The six-eared macaque shouted shrilly at Han Sen. You're awesome. The fake body was able to trick Li Chunxiu. It even tricked me. This six-eared macaque's fake body skill makes it invincible. Han Sen thought in awe. The six-eared macaque looked murderous. It glared at Han Sen and said, earlier, with that very high monster nearby, I had to fake my own death. But now there is no need for me to hide. After I kill you, I can go out into outer sky. Even if that very high monster realizes that the body was a fake and comes back here to get me, he won't be able to find me. That idea isn't a bad one, but I'm afraid that you're wrong about one thing. Han Sen laughed. What's that? The six-eared macaque asked, its eyes glittering at Han Sr. I'm scarier than that very high monster. If you quietly left earlier while you had the chance, you could have gotten away free. It is a shame you wanted to murder me instead. I'm afraid you'll be the one who ends up dead today. Han Sen sounded serious. You are just a half-deified. How dare you try to bluff me? The six-eared macaque shouted furiously. It ran toward Han Senator Han Sen's Apollo set shone as he threw a punch toward the six-eared macaque. Pang! Han Sen's punch caught the six-eared macaque's body mid-leap and tore it in half. It was just a fake body, however. The six-eared macaque's real form was gone. Pang! The six-eared macaque suddenly appeared behind Han's senator. It punched Han's son in the back, sending him hurtling forward. It was a long time before he came to a stop. There was a dent in the back of the Apollo set, in the shape of a fist. The Apollo set seemed to be on the verge of breaking. "How dare you act so cocky in front of me?" the six-eared macaque screamed. It jumped at Han's son again. This monkey is so strong. It can use fake bodies, and its ability to hide its presence is unsurpassed. It is so hard to avoid it. Han's son eyed at the six-eared macaque, but he didn't fall back. He threw a punch to meet the beast. The six-eared macaque's body was destroyed, but once again, it was only a fake body. Han's son didn't know where the real body had gone. Han's son's heart leaped, and he cast the Dongxian Sutra. Everything in the universe became a cogwheel in his eyes. Although he couldn't see the body of the six-eared macaque, he could see the cogwheels of the universe that were moving while the six-eared macaque remained invisible. The six-eared macaque was so angry. Its eyes were shining with rage, and it flashed toward Han's son with great speed. It stared into Han's son's eyes, raised its claws, and tried to slash Han's son's eyes out. Seeing that it was almost in front of him, Han's son swung his fist. He sent his punch toward the invisible albeit real body of his foe. The six-eared macaque was shocked. It had no idea how Han's son had discovered where its real body was. It was too close, and it had no time to dodge. It sent a punch of its own to counter Han's son's fist. The six-eared macaque found itself wrapped up in a soft snowfall. The shadow of a snow lady covered its body. Chapter 27:27. I am not convinced the six-eared macaque didn't pay much attention to the snowy attack in the beginning. It was focused on fighting Han's son, but that snow lady continued to envelop the six-eared macaque. Although the monkey wasn't affected by the cold power, it wasn't long until its eyes started to become heavy. Soon, it slumped down on a star fruit and fell into a deep sleep. Han's son saw that it didn't have a single flake of ice sticking to it. He had expected that the ice power might not work on the six-eared macaque, but the sleeping powers that came with it were not something the six-eared macaque could withstand. As the creature slept deeply on top of the fruit, its arms and legs spread in an undignified sprawl. Han's son wanted to kill the six-eared macaque. But then he thought, right now, the six-eared macaque is sleeping. I wonder if the very high contract can work on it. This monkey's power is so unique. If I can make a contract with it, it might be useful. With that thought, Han's son activated the very high contract skill. He didn't have much hope of it working, but when he actually tried it, he felt the contract click into place. I didn't think it would actually work. The six-eared macaque was still sleeping, with the shadow of the snow lady hovering over it. Han's son waited until the snow lady was gone. Although Han's son had performed the snow lady attack himself, he couldn't control it fully. It had a mind of its own. That was the biggest con of the deified Geno Core's Geno art. After a few hours, the shadow of the snow lady finally disappeared. Han's son noticed that the six-eared macaque was still fast asleep, so he gave it a swift kick in the butt, knocking it some distance away. The six-eared macaque was shocked by its rude awakening. It jumped up off the ground, gold substance chains rising around it. It squealed and moved forward to attack Han's senator. Han's son used his mind, and the markings of the contract spell appeared on the six-eared macaque's forehead. Padong! The six-eared macaque fell back onto the star fruit. It placed its hands over its head and twitched repeatedly, as if it was in agony. When he saw that a deified xenogeniac was in too much pain to use its powers, Han's son was more than surprised by the effectiveness of the very high contract skill. Monkey, are you going to obey me? Han's son asked the monkey, shutting off the pain that the contract's power was inflicting on the six-eared macaque. The monkey released a warbling shriek and leaped off the fruit. It blurred as it rushed toward Han's son, gold light shining behind it. It suddenly teleported in front of Han's senator. Han's son swallowed. Just as the six-eared macaque was about to touch Han's son, the beast grabbed its own head and fell backward. It bounced off a nearby branch, then a piece of star fruit. Then it fell all the way to slam into the ground. It created a big hole in the ground when it landed. Monkey, are you going to obey me and adhere to my every command? Han's son asked again, stopping the flow of the contract's power. You used a trick to fool me. I'm not convinced. If you are this strong, then beat me for real. This time, the six-eared macaque didn't jump forward with its fist swinging. It looked murderous, and it squealed at Han Sen fiercely. Beating you wouldn't be hard. Han Sen laughed. Huh, you couldn't even beat that star beetle. I really don't think you can beat me. If you hadn't used a trick, I would have raised my hand and killed you. The six-eared macaque looked angry. Han Sen looked at the six-eared macaque with surprise. How did you know I fought the star beetles here? The six-eared macaque didn't attack. It looked at him with disdain and said, I am a born deified. I'm not like those other normal xenogeniacs in the star fruits. I know many things when I am born. I know everything that happens here. Born deified? Han Sen was more than shocked hearing this. That xenogeniac had a much higher chance of evolving, all the way up to true god class. If you didn't use a trick, how could you beat me? The six-eared macaque continued, still talking in a cocky tone of voice. Fine. I will give you a chance. I won't use the contract's power, and if you beat me, I will give you your freedom back. If you lose, then I will be your master. And then you must start listening to me, okay? Han Sen smiled. Sure. Why not? The six-eared macaque said quickly. Clearly, it was more than confident that it could defeat Han Senator. It was afraid Han Sen would regret his decision to do this. Han Sen's Apollo set was bursting with a god light again. The Apollo wings spread, making him look like a god in the sky. He looked down on the six-eared macaque and said, Come on. Show me how powerful a born deified xenogeniac really is. The six-eared macaque didn't speak. Its eyes flashed, and its body exploded with a golden light. It was like some elemental of gold fire rushing toward Han Senator. Countless claws of gold light surged toward Han Sen, looking like they could cut the sky and earth. Han Sen was covered in the claw light. Han Sen flapped his wings and dodged the attacks. But the next second, the six-eared macaque appeared next to Han Senator. It attacked Han Sen's penis like a monkey stealing a peach. The six-eared macaque thought his fake body and invisibility could hide his true self. But as a matter of fact, Han Sen could see every movement the beast made. Han Sen moved his body slightly and dodged the evil, peach-stealing monkey's skill. Han Sen looked calm. He seemed to be calm with everything that he did. There was nothing special about a monkey going for the crown jewels. But that six-eared macaque was now being put at a disadvantage. The six-eared macaque was terribly upset. When it fought Shale hadn't been able to tell where its true body was. Even in the end, it had only been using one fake body. So Shale had a 50% chance of finding the true body. He was still unable to find its invisible self. If the monkey had used all of its power, it could have defeated Shale. It was afraid of Li Chunqiu though. But now that it was fighting against Han Sen, its invisibility and fake bodies weren't working. Whether it used a fake body or went invisible, Han Sen could see everything. It was useless, and the creature began to collect injuries. Not fair. Not fair. The six-eared macaque suddenly started screaming as it became desperate. What isn't fair? Han Sen asked with a smile, pausing his attacks. You don't have the power. You just have treasures. Even if you beat me, it is the treasure's power, not your own. I'm not convinced. The six-eared macaque looked scornful and said, If you didn't use treasure, I could defeat you with my pinky. Fine. I will not use treasures then. And if I don't use treasures and you still lose, will you listen to my commands? Han Sen remained smiling, and he didn't move. Huh. If you don't use treasure, I will rip you to shreds, the six-eared macaque said. Then let's give it a try, Han Sen said. Then he took off his Apollo armor. Before Han Sen could say anything, the six-eared macaque squealed loudly. It leaped at Han Sen, its eyes full of murderous intentions. Without the buffs of the Apollo set, Han Sen's power and speed were worse than the six-eared macaque's. It would be very difficult to avoid its attacks, and he couldn't fight it now. But Han Sen didn't try to avoid a strike. A gleam entered his eyes, and his face had a weird blush. The Blood Pulse Sutra was running in reverse. Chapter 27-28 Can't even be a sun. When the Blood Pulse Sutra reversed, it became the Xian Yellow Sutra. As the six-eared macaque jumped in front of him, Han Sen threw forth a slap. The Xian Yellow Sutra's power smacked into the six-eared macaque. The six-eared macaque was deified, and Han's son wasn't being supported by any treasures. In the eyes of the monkey, he was a barebones half-deified. The monkey didn't bother dodging Han Sen's strike, and so Han Sen's attack swept over it. The monkey had become too eager with the thought of tearing Han's son to pieces. But when the Xian Yellow Sutra's power came upon it, the six-eared macaque's body shook. Its blood pulse reversed, and its power just disappeared. Its body and fur were changing, shriveling as if it was dying. What is going on here? The six-eared macaque saw its body withering away more and more. It looked horrified. Han's son didn't answer. He calmly looked upon the six-eared macaque. The changes to the six-eared macaque's body became stronger and stronger. Its gold hair that shone like a sun suddenly dimmed, and its gold eyes no longer had their shine. And then there was a weird snapping noise. The six-eared macaque's substance chains fell apart. In a moment, it went from deified to king class. It still had half-deified power, but it was much worse than it had been before. Previously it had been high in the sky, but now it was on the ground. How can this be possible? The six-eared macaque's eyes were wide with terror. It couldn't believe it had become king class. What did you do to me? What sort of trick have you used on me again? The six-eared macaque snarled. Then it spun toward Han Senior Monkey. Did you know that I have a title here in this universe? Hansen asked, smiling at the six-eared macaque. I don't give a wet fart about your title. What trick did you use on me? The six-eared macaque kept jumping around and shouting, but it didn't dare to attack Han's son again. One strike had reduced him to a lowly king-class being. He never imagined such a thing was possible. He was now quite scared of Han's senator. He didn't dare to attack Han's son again. Han's son ignored the squealing of the six-eared macaque. He laughed and said, In the universe, people call me the Father of God. Do you know why I earned this title? How do I? God's father? You are so cocky. Upon hearing Hansen's title, the monkey looked even more annoyed. That monkey was deified, but Han's son seemed to be claiming to have a higher rank. It was clear that the monkey didn't agree with him. Han's son looked at the six-eared macaque, and with a disdainful tone of voice he said, The people in the universe call me God's father because deified elites are like children before me. I let them become my sons and daughters if they are qualified. If I don't permit a man to become my son, then his best hope is to become my grandchild. Just like you. You aren't qualified to be my son. The monkey was frozen. He wished to say something, but when he thought of how Hansen's strike had reduced him to king class, what Hansen said seemed to make sense. I don't care. You must have used some sort of trick on me. If you think you have what it takes, shut up. Hansen hissed coldly, cutting the monkey off. He stared icily at the monkey and said, I saw that there is talent in you, and I wanted to keep you alive, but you still didn't appreciate my mercy. Do you really think I won't kill you? The gods in my eyes are a bunch of rubbish. I let them live. They live. If I want them dead, they die. I let them be gods. If I am not happy, the gods are mere toys to me. After that, Hansen's body shone with a godly light. He raised his hand, ready to kill the monkey. The six-eared macaque was very scared already. Now, it was super scared by the might of Han's senator. It shivered violently and shouted with fear, saying, Don't kill me. I'm willing to obey. Don't worry about it. There's no need to push yourself. Han's son glared at the six-eared macaque. His hands rose, ready to kill the creature. The six-eared macaque quickly said, I'm not pushing myself. I'm really not pushing myself. It would be a glorious thing to follow an elite like you. Can you return me to deified class? That isn't difficult. Come over here. Han's son looked like a god as he stared down on the six-eared macaque from above. The six-eared macaque looked hesitant and unwilling to come close to Han Sr. If I wanted to kill you, all I would need to do is raise my hand. It wouldn't be that difficult. Han's son looked at the fiend with disdain. The six-eared macaque forced a smile. No, I'm not suspicious of your intent. The six-eared macaque ran over to Han's senator. Its body was half the average height of a human's, and as it stood before Han's son, it looked like a little kid. Han's son looked at it and raised his hand. He touched its head like a godfather and said, I, Han's son, by the name of all gods, give you eternal holy power. Open the door of destiny. Han Sun made up a bunch of nonsense that worked well to bluff the six-eared macaque. It had no idea that Han Sun was just wasting time and putting on a show. Han Sun just needed to wait until the effects of the Xian Yellow Sutra wore off. Then, the six-eared macaque would be deified again. Han Sun wouldn't even need to use the Blood Pulse Sutra. He just randomly cast a light on the six-eared macaque's head. Han Sun calculated the time and slowly spoke his fabricated blessing. By the time he was done, the Xian Yellow Sutra's power had disintegrated. The body of the six-eared macaque changed again. The six-eared macaque saw Han Sun's power inside its body, and it felt its body change. It quickly became deified again, which filled the creature with joy and relief. It was so happy to be deified again, and it was scared of the man before it. He could reduce or raise the monkey's level on a whim. This guy is too scary. It looks like it might be true that he is some sort of father of God. He might be king class, but I am inferior to him in every way. I can't fight him. For a while at least, I need to stop trying to beat him. The six-eared macaque tried to comfort itself. It was terrified, and it no longer dared to fight Han Senator when the six-eared macaque was back to deified class. It immediately kneeled before Han Sun and said, "I'm willing to follow you now and forever. I hope you let bygones be bygones, and are still willing to take me under your wing." While its mouth spoke, in the six-eared macaque's heart, it was saying to itself, "Let me find out your true self. Then, I will find a chance to escape this trap and maybe even kill you." Han Sun could discern what the six-eared macaque was thinking, but he didn't confront the beast. He coldly said, "You should think this through. Once you start following me, there is no chance for regret. I have thought about it. I will only follow you for the rest of my life, and I will only ever pledge allegiance to you," the six-eared macaque said dramatically, but his true intent was the opposite. "Get up and tell me your name." Han Sun allowed the six-eared macaque to stand up. "I am the six-eared macaque. I do not have a name," the creature said. "In that case, I will give you a name." Han Sun fell silent for some time, and then said, "Since you are a monkey deified xenogeneic and a six-eared macaque, I will call you Little Number 6. The six-eared macaque froze when it heard Han Sen's grand pronouncement. Its heart complained, "That is a crap name. He was quiet for so long, and he ended up giving me such a childish name." Chapter 27-29 Good Fortune Pool. After Shale and Li Chunxiu teleported away from the star tree, Shale set down the six-eared macaque's body so that they could examine it. As Li Chunxiu looked it over, he realized something was wrong. He swung his fist, throwing a punch at the corpse. When the blow landed, the six-eared macaque's body turned to dust. How could this happen? Shale's face had gone blank with shock. He shook himself, turning to go back to the star tree. Li Chunxiu stopped him and said, "It is too late to go back now. We've been gone for too long, and the creature must have escaped into outer sky and disappeared by now. With Han Sun guarding star tree, I don't think it will have been able to run off so easily," Shale said. "If I was unable to detect the real six-eared macaque, I don't think Han Sun could have done so, either," Li Chunxiu said emotionlessly. "And even if he did discover it, do you really think he could stop the six-eared macaque from escaping the star tree? It was all my fault. I couldn't distinguish the fake body from the real one," Shale said. Li Chunxiu shook his head. "There is no need to blame yourself. The six-eared macaque's fake body was really good. Not even I was able to detect the real one. This blame doesn't lie on your shoulders." After pausing, Li Chunxiu provided further comfort by saying, "Outer sky has countless xenogeneics. You'll be able to hunt some more creatures soon, but don't leave just yet. Han Sun will visit the Good Fortune Pool soon. We can go after he does it." Shale nodded. The Good Fortune Pool will certainly change his power, but it affects every creature differently. I wonder how much Han Sun will benefit from it. "I don't believe any will receive a benefit as grand as you received," Li Chunxiu said flatly. Han Sun thought Li Chunxiu and Shale would come looking for the six-eared macaque, but after waiting a while, he didn't see them return. The next morning, Han Sun told Little Number 6 to guard the star tree with the other xenogeneics. Bauer decided to stay behind as well, and Han Sun headed to the Good Fortune Pool by himself. Han's son was in a rush to get to the good fortune pool, because he wanted to use it before Exquisite and Likir found out about it. He wanted to use the pool to bring Jade Skin and the Dongxian Sutra up to half-deified. If the two girls were there, he couldn't risk using those two Geno arts in front of them. In truth, the good fortune pool wasn't really a pool at all. It was more like a well. According to what Hansen knew about it, the water inside the good fortune pool wasn't really water. It was a fluid created from the remains of dead xenogeneics. That was what the Very High had told Han's son at least. Whether or not it was true, he didn't know. No one knew for certain what lay at the furthest reaches of the good fortune pool. Not even true god deifieds could reach the bottom. Although the Very High elites couldn't physically reach the bottom of the pool, they had analyzed it and determined that it contained the bodies of a giant group of deified xenogeneics. Those powerful deifieds must have died there billions and billions of years ago, and their deified flesh had remained there ever since. Over time, their essence had liquefied and filled up the whole of their grave to become the good fortune pool. The process had worked something like the formation of oil. Because the good fortune pool had many deified genes inside it, it could reinforce the genes of the creatures that bathed in it. The benefits that a person received were determined by how long they could stay inside the pool and how much of it they could absorb. All this information on the good fortune pool was just guesswork on the part of the Very High though. As for the truth, no one knew for sure. But when people entered the good fortune pool, some could trigger the water of the pool to create something weird. Once in the past, a golem had entered the good fortune pool. He reacted with the water, and everyone nearby had a vision of an ancient deified xenogeneic hitting a sky statue. Because of this weird vision, that golem seemed to absorb far more water than other creatures. The water seeped all the way through his body, and then the golem went on to achieve so much. It almost became a true god. Although it failed in the end, it was a miracle that a golem had been able to accomplish as much as it did. Han's son didn't expect himself to be able to trigger some sort of vision. He merely hoped to absorb as much good fortune pool water as he could. The Very High theorized that the reason some people could trigger the strange scenes inside the good fortune pool was because they could reach the deeper parts of the pool. When the swimmer encountered the remains of beings whose power operated on the same wavelength as his own, a vision could be triggered. The bloodline of the humans was derived from the crystallizers, and the history of the crystallizers didn't go back very far. There was no way they had reached the outer sky all that time ago, only to end up buried inside the good fortune pool. So, Han's son didn't think his presence would activate a vision. According to the Very High, the good fortune water accumulated as the deified genes in the grave began to mutate. Those mutations always yielded something good. Of course, if someone absorbed too much and mutated too far, it might harm their bodies. The key was in how much one could take. Overindulging in the water was risky. If a person took too little, the changes in his body wouldn't be obvious. In regards to how much they should take, it all depended on the swimmer's fitness and durability. Han's son stood outside the palace that housed the good fortune pool. He didn't see Li Chunxiu, but Shale was also standing outside the palace. It looked as if the lion-headed man might have been waiting for him. "Brother Shale, can I use the good fortune pool now?" Han's son handed the good fortune spell to Shale. "Of course. I was waiting here, so I could open the good fortune hall for you," Shale said. He accepted Han's son's good fortune spell, then took out a similar spell of his own. He slid the two spells into the locks on the door. "Catcha." The good fortune hall's door slowly opened. Shale made a welcoming gesture and said, "I hope you can use the good fortune pool to gain strength and become deified." "I hope so as well, Brother Shale. I'm going in now." Han's son gave the man a nod and walked into the good fortune hall. In the center of the palace, there was a pool made of jade stone. The water was utterly still, without a single wave or ripple upon the surface. The water should have been transparent, but because the pool was so deep, it was completely dark. It looked like a portal to hell. Although the pool was as calm as a deep well, Han's son could feel the scary presence coming from it. The quiet pool of water was surging with energy like an erupting volcano. It was hundreds of thousands of times scarier than the life force of a deified creature. Just standing next to the pool, Han Sun felt as if his body would melt. What an insanely powerful life force. No wonder this good fortune pool is legendary, Han Sun said quietly to himself. Without hesitation, he jumped headfirst into the good fortune pool. When Han Sun jumped into the pool, Li Chunxiu suddenly appeared next to Shale. He watched the good fortune pool with Shale. I wonder if Han Sun will become deified inside the good fortune pool, Shale said to himself. He is just a crystallizer. Unlike you, he won't receive old xenogenic blood and trigger a vision. There's no way for him to gain much. He won't become deified, but he will earn a few benefits to help him along, Li Chunxiu said dispassionately. Chapter 27:30 Crazy Consume. When Han Sun entered the good fortune pool, it felt like he had jumped into a hot spring. Heat rushed into him through his pores, pouring through his body. Han Sun grinned widely at the sensation. That hot air was some kind of life force. The good fortune pool should also reinforce his genes, but that life force alone would benefit him a great deal. Under the cleansing power of that intense life force, Han Sun felt his body filling with energy. It was like he could play mahjong for 3 days in a row without getting tired. But the pure life force wouldn't be enough to cause changes in Han Sun's actual body. Han Sun cleared his head and started casting the Dongxian Sutra, so he could absorb the gene powers of the pool in the hopes of achieving a breakthrough. As soon as Han Sun began to cast the Dongxian Sutra, he felt like there was an unstoppable channel of energy surging into his body. It made each cell of his body come alive and rapidly change. A mere second later, Han Sun felt something thicken within his Dongxian Sutra. The Geno art was showing signs of the 9 tiers condensing into one. Too strong. It's too strong. This good fortune pool is unbelievable. Han Sun was as shocked as he was happy. The good fortune pool's energy was so strong, and it was giving him more power than he had expected. By a substantial margin too. If I had known what an incredible resource this pool is, I would have found a way to come here sooner. I would just need to take a bath. Becoming half deified that way would be easier than giving myself a scrub. If I had come here sooner, my 4 Geno arts would have become half deified a long time ago. I would have saved myself a lot of trouble, Han Sun thought as he continued to run the Dongxian Sutra as rapidly as possible. Buzz! A moment later, Han Sun felt like his body was exploding with power. It felt like countless universal cogwheels were spinning with the Dongxian Sutra. The force of it pushed Han Sun's Dongxian Sutra's cogwheel, easily spurring him on to become half deified. Han Sun was surprised, but he didn't have time to explore the differences that had come by reaching half deified with the Dongxian Sutra. He immediately cast Jade Skin. He wanted to use the frightening power around him to boost Jade Skin as well. Everything was going swimmingly, because the good fortune pool was giving Han Sun so much power. When Jade Skin absorbed the power, Han Sun didn't feel any resistance. The Geno art went straight into the condensing sequence, and all its tiers combined into one. Han Sun's entire body transformed into icy jade. He suddenly looked like a statue. As Jade Skin kept changing, his body became more and more like crystal. It shone as clearly and radiantly as a diamond. Catcha! The jade veneer suddenly tore itself off, like flaky dust being swept away from Han Sun's body. Layer after layer, it went, and as it peeled away, the flesh of Han Sun's body was reborn. It was like he had gotten rid of his old bones and installed a fresh skeleton. It's leveling up already? Han Sun could barely believe this. Elevating the Dongxian Sutra and Jade Skin to half deified had been the simplest thing in the world. And there was even more gene power surging into his body. It was like he had expected rainfall. But now an entire river of water was plunging down on him. It was too much. Han Sun could scarcely comprehend it. Something is wrong. Something must be wrong. Han Sun continued to absorb the energy, but he couldn't understand what was going on. According to the analysis of the Very High, the good fortune pool had been created by different deified xenogenic genes combining together. It was a mixture. Therefore, the composition of the water was quite complicated. When ordinary creatures entered the good fortune pool, they absorbed a lot of the good fortune pool's water, but they could only refine the gene power of the water that was compatible with their own genes. A lot of the harmful gene power had to be neutralized or expunged. Otherwise, it could seriously damage their bodies. For instance, if a creature that practiced fire powers came to the good fortune pool, it would have to expel all the water element powers that it absorbed. Otherwise, the conflicting element would damage the fire creature. Because most of the gene power in the water wouldn't suit most people, a person couldn't spend too long inside the pool. When the harmful gene power reached a high enough level to harm the body, they would have to leave the good fortune pool. Once they left the pool, they would have to carefully release all the harmful gene power. If the person in the pool triggered a vision, then the vision would release other gene powers and attract helpful gene powers for the person to absorb. So when a vision appeared, the person could absorb vast amounts of gene powers, far more than usual. The harmful gene powers would only be a small part of the mixture. Therefore, the benefits those people received would be far better than those who couldn't trigger a vision, and they could spend much longer inside the good fortune pool. But now Han Sen's situation was a strange one. He had been absorbing the powers of the good fortune genes for a while. A vision had yet to appear, but the gene powers that he was absorbing seemed perfectly compatible with every fiber of his being. None of the gene powers seemed harmful to him, as the theories he had heard suggested they should be. It was like all the good fortune water was the purest type of gene power. Every drop helped him and aided the progress of his genoarts. There wasn't a speck of harm entering him. Han Sen swallowed like a whale and sucked like a mosquito. He absorbed more and more energy. He was taking in so much that he was almost afraid. I'm absorbing so much gene power. Why isn't something stopping my progress? It is like I can keep on sucking down as much as I want to. This is so weird, Han Sen thought, slightly disturbed. It felt as if he had gone to a steakhouse buffet. Most people could eat 3 steaks before being full, while Han Sen had already eaten a dozen, and he was still going strong. His belly seemed to have endless room for him to keep on munching. Even Han Sen was surprised by this unusual situation. He was almost afraid to keep on eating. Is it because my body doesn't have any special elements, so I can absorb any elemental gene power? Is that why this weird situation is happening? Han Sen thought to himself. Although this explanation seemed a bit unconvincing, the good stuff that was coming into his mouth wasn't something he was going to refuse. This is a lot of energy. If I keep on taking it in, will I become deified straight away? Han Sen was both awed and pleased by that thought. If that is true, that would be awesome. Han Sen cast the story of genes like crazy. Over the years that he had practiced it, the Geno art had always demanded more sources than he had to give. He didn't know where or when he would find an opportunity like this again, if he didn't take advantage of it now. Han Sen absorbed the power from the good fortune pool like mad. Shale and Li Chunxiu were watching the changes occur from outside the good fortune pool. The good fortune pool's life force was as insane as it always was. The spring water was swirling like a vortex. But other than that, nothing weird was happening. They didn't see Han Sen come up to the surface. It has been half an hour. Why has Han Sen not come out yet? Shale asked with confusion. For a king that hadn't triggered a vision, half an hour was usually the longest they could last. Even the best half-deified would end up harming their body after that. But Han Sen had neither activated a vision nor emerged from the good fortune pool. It wasn't only Shale who was curious about this. Li Chunxiu was as well. Chapter 27:31 God Body Evolved. Han Sen really isn't bad. It is impressive for a crystallizer to last half an hour inside there. He is a very rare specimen, Li Chunxiu said while staring into the water. But after another half hour, Han Sen still hadn't emerged from the good fortune pool. Now, even Li Chunxiu's face looked stunned. It has been an hour, and he still isn't out yet. This should be what a primitive deified can achieve, right? Shale said with shock. Li Chunxiu nodded and said, according to our best theory, half-deifieds can only last half an hour at the most. Unless they manage to trigger a vision, that is. Then they can last more than an hour. A primitive deified can last 1 hour. Li Chunxiu trailed off. He was wondering why Han Sen was taking so long, and why he had yet to come out. Little did they knew, Han Sen himself was just as confused as they were. He had already consumed more power than his body had previously contained, but he wasn't stopping there. He felt like he could still absorb more and more. It was like his nervous system was impaired, and he didn't know when to feel full. Deified Gene +1. Deified Progress. 30/100 Suddenly, a voice sounded inside Han Sen's ears. It shocked him. When he heard what it said, he was so happy. Holy shit! The water inside the good fortune pool can increase my tally of deified genes. Is it just like the very high predicted? Are these waters here because the deified genes melded with the water itself? Han Sen was floored. It had been so long since he had earned a deified gene. He couldn't believe he could get them here. Han Sen had tried to consume deified genes before, but he hadn't been able to digest them. These mutated deified genes, however, were being absorbed without issue. Right now, Han Sen didn't care how long he had to stay underwater. This was a fantastic opportunity, so he wasn't going to stop until he was stuffed to the gills. Deified Gene +1. Deified Progress. 40 out of 100. Not long later, Han Sen's brain played a similar announcement. After hearing the announcement again, Han Sen tried even harder to absorb the power of the good fortune water. His body was sinking lower, driving him deeper and deeper into the pool. And the further he went, the stronger the gene power became. Han Sen floated inside the good fortune pool, continuing to absorb what he could. Shale and Li Chunxiu were still on the outside, looking pretty freaked out. They had been waiting for 2 hours by this point, and they saw no sign of Han Sen coming back to the surface. That itself was a big problem. Shale was a deified when he entered the good fortune pool, and he had even triggered a vision, but he only lasted 2 hours. Now, Han Sen had been in there almost as long as Shale, and he yet to show a sign of coming back out. This was so strange. Han Sen's body should still be half deified. He must have taken in so much gene power. Even if it was all somehow beneficial for him, it should have filled his body to overflowing by now. How can he still be down there? Shale asked in a whisper. Li Chunxiu looked into the water but didn't speak. He was trying to guess what might have happened to Han Senator. He considered many possibilities, but he didn't think any of them made sense. In short, unless Han Sen had become deified, the good fortune pool's gene power should have blown him up by now. If Han Sen was becoming deified inside the good fortune pool, there should have been a big movement on the surface to let them know what had happened. They would have noticed something like that. The pool shouldn't have been as quiet as it was right now, but it didn't seem possible that Han Sen was dying down there either. Creatures had died in the pool before, overloaded by the power that they had taken in. But as they died, their powers would explode rather violently. Shale and Li Chunxiu would sense it if that happened. What is he doing under there? Li Chunxiu couldn't contain his curiosity. Although he was in charge of the good fortune pool, he couldn't just hop in and check. The good fortune pool had incredible gene powers, but the ingredients that composed it were too complicated. Once someone reached the maximum level of harmful gene powers they could tolerate and left the pool, they could begin to slowly purge those destructive powers. However, their core genes would be forever affected. They would live with side effects from then on. These side effects didn't affect one's body in practice, but if that person wanted to enter the good fortune pool again, the rate at which they accumulated harmful gene powers would be greatly increased. Entering the water again could be very dangerous for them. So, ordinary people could only earn benefits the first time they entered the good fortune pool. Entering the good fortune pool again would make these side effects get worse. After a few times, most people couldn't even touch the water anymore. That was the situation that Li Chunxiu found himself in. He wanted to dive into the pool and take a look, but he simply couldn't. Shale had only just entered the good fortune pool, so he couldn't go in again either. The two of them had no choice but to watch from the edge of the pool. They hoped that Han Sen would come back out, so they could learn what he had managed to accomplish down there. Deified Gene +1. Deified Progress. 56 out of 100 Han Sen was still frantically pulling in the gene powers of the good fortune water. His deified progress was moving steadily forward. Am I going to become deified? Han Sen was so excited. If he could become deified here, then in the eyes of the universe, he would have the basic authority to start his own race. That meant he could represent humans and start a war for a lantern in the Geno Hall. Humans could become a high race, fighting the Extreme King, or a big race like the sky wouldn't be realistic. He would have to find some higher races that only had a couple deifieds, or maybe none at all. If that happened, Han Sun would be confident in his ability to pick on them. Of course, every high race had connections. He couldn't just start a war with whoever he wanted. Just like the rebate. If anyone tried to start a lantern war with them, they would have to think about how Sky Palace would react. Han Sun wasn't worried about it too much though. He just had to find a high race that was allied with the Extreme King, and then snuff out their lantern. There was no love lost between him and the Extreme King anyway, so battling them was going to happen someday regardless. Deified Gene +1. Deified progress. 98 out of 100 inches. Time went by. Han Sun's deified progress went higher and higher. Han Sun could feel the power collecting inside of him. There were changes occurring in his body that felt like they could flip the sky and the earth. These changes weren't connected to any of his 4 Geno arts. It was his body itself that was changing. It was a process that he couldn't have begun to describe. His flesh, his bones, his organs, and every cell in his body was changing. Deified Gene +1. Deified progress. 100 out of 100. God body evolving. When his deified progress reached 100, Han Sun felt like his body was a flower, and the petals were falling away one by one. He felt like a serpent peeling off its skin. The feeling was beyond anything that Han Sun had previously imagined, and although it was incredibly strange, it also felt amazingly good. Chapter 27:32 Weird scene. Like a tide, Shale and Li Chunxiu were staring nervously down into the good fortune pool, when the water suddenly fountained up like a spring. It gushed up 10 meters into the air, and many strange waves swept over the surface of the water. BZD. Before they could figure out what was happening, a shadow rose from the spring water. A watery manifestation of an old giant beast appeared. The beast was enormous and prehistorically scary. It had 2 heads, and 4 wings spread from its back. The moment it appeared, it roared to the sky. The deafening noise of its roar echoed throughout the hall. A 2-headed demon dragon? Why are we seeing one of these old monsters? The Crystallizer's bloodline can't have any links to a 2-headed demon dragon. Li Chunxiu stared at the creature he was seeing in shock. His head was filled to the brim with questions. Before he could find any answers to those questions, the image of the 2-headed demon dragon disappeared. A second later, another creature rose from the pool. Its shape was huge but elegant, like some ancient bird from legend. It flapped its wings as it rose from the water. It flew around the good fortune pool and released a hawk-like cry. God Phoenix. Li Chunxiu had practiced the very high sense to an extreme degree, but his face was still turning white. He could no longer keep his heart calm. Han Sun hadn't triggered one vision. He had activated 2. It was difficult to believe. The 2-headed demon dragon and the god Phoenix were old xenogeneics. Their bloodlines had long since gone extinct, and it would be difficult to find any trace of them left in the universe. Even if some remnant of their presence lingered in the universe, surely it wouldn't be found in a crystallizer, of all beings. Li Chunxiu couldn't imagine how Han Sun had been able to trigger the visions of those 2 majestic xenogeneics. But whatever was happening obviously wasn't finished yet. When the image of the god Phoenix faded, the good fortune pool was still being rocked by wave after wave. Another image appeared. Shale was frozen now. He had the bloodline of the lion, and it had been incredibly lucky that he was able to trigger the lion-head lion vision in the good fortune pool. Han Sun was just a crystallizer, but he had managed to trigger 3 visions of old creatures. It was hard to believe that their eyes weren't playing tricks on them. Even more frightening was the fact that the visions kept appearing. The xenogeneics were appearing casually one after another, as if this was a daily occurrence. It made the skies above the good fortune pool look like a zoo. Li Chunxiu and Shale stood before the pool, frozen in place. They stared at the unfolding visions, stupefied. Their brains weren't functioning anymore. They couldn't form logical thoughts about what they were seeing. They couldn't imagine why the good fortune pool was displaying so many grand visions. These creatures couldn't have been related to the crystallizer inside the pool. How could they all be showing up because of Han Sen, who was from a weak race? Han Sen didn't have any idea what was going on either. His deified genes had reached 100 now. After his god body evolved, the visions appeared deep in the good fortune pool, then rushed past him and vanished over his head. Each time, Han Sen felt something strange in his body get peeled away. There was a phantom sensation deep within Han Sen, one that he could barely even sense. He felt something peeling away inside him, but it didn't seem to affect him. And when those weird visions appeared, they made the gene powers in his body purer. The changes within him accelerated. Han Sen could only think in his heart. The creatures in the sanctuaries were crafted from the xenogenic blood of those in the universe, and I ate a lot of creature flesh in my time there. I claimed their genes to make myself stronger. Maybe it's their blood that is being affected on some level. My time in the sanctuaries left some remnants of those creatures' blood genes. When the god body evolves, it triggers those small gene messages. Is that how these weird visions are appearing? Han Sen thought that his guess sounded reasonable, but he didn't know if it was the truth. He didn't have time to confirm the validity of this theory either. As he reached the end of this train of thought, his body had reached the most important moment of evolution. He didn't have time for anything else. Changes began to flow through Han Sen's flesh, flipping his world on its head. It was like every cell within him was being reborn. It made his body become as pure as a newborn baby's. There was nothing about him that wasn't new and clean. But Han Sen didn't hear his god body finish evolving. His body stopped evolving, and the 4 Geno arts inside him started to run. The Blood Pulse Sutra, the Dongxian Sutra, Jade Skin, and the Story of Genes. Those 4 Geno arts were running inside Han Sen's body at the same time. His mouth went dry in shock. There were many aspects of these 4 Geno arts that were the same. If they ran simultaneously, there could be a conflict. It might even mess up his chi. In a worst-case scenario, Han Sen's body might even collapse. But despite his worries, the 4 Geno arts ran smoothly on their own, and Han Sen's body seemed unaffected. There was no conflict or clashes between them. The Blood Pulse Sutra and Jade Skin were xenogenic powers. They affected the cells of his entire body. The changes they wrought on Han Sen were thorough and strange. But the focus and purpose of the 2 skills were different from each other. Although both of them affected Han Sen's cells, the Blood Pulse Sutra had a heightened focus on one's blood and organs. Jade Skin directed its power into a person's bones. Under the influence of those 2 powers, Han Sen's whole body was unleashing its deified potential. Many illusory substance chains were forming across Han Sen's body. The Dongxian Sutra and the Story of Genes were the powers of gene armaments. They affected Han Sen's body, but the biggest changes came from the armaments themselves. The Dongxian armor and spell changed quickly, releasing substance chains as they did. These 2 substance chains were clearly different from one another. The substance chains of the Dongxian armor were black. The formation of each link in the chain was very complicated, as if the chain represented every law of nature that governed the universe. Spell's substance chain was white. Somehow, it seemed to be completely independent of the rules of the universe. It existed on its own, devoid of any attachment that might weigh it down. Aside from Spell's connection with Han Sen, it was like it was outside the universe. As the 4 Geno arts kept changing, Han Sen's body started to change too. His body became a xenogenic gene. He looked like a scary humanoid xenogenic. Just as the 4 Geno arts were about to finish evolving, when he was about to become deified, he suddenly felt the power of the 4 Geno arts overtake his body. It created a conflict. PFF. Han Sen coughed up blood. The cells of his whole body were crushed under the conflicting force of 4 different powers. He could barely withstand the pressure, and his power twisted painfully. The 4 powers that had almost become deified were now gone. The substance chains that had almost formed had now collapsed. Chapter 2733 Dead Cycle. The 4 powers inside Han Sen's body kept colliding with each other, doing grievous injury to Han Sen's body. His blood pulse was disrupted and fractured. It was a mess. Luckily, although Han Sen wasn't deified yet, His body was already as strong as a deified. If he was an ordinary half-deified, his body would have been completely crushed by the 4 disrupted powers. Although Han Sun hadn't been completely destroyed yet, the situation wasn't good. When the 4 powers fell out of rhythm, they began to impact each other with explosive force. No matter how strong Han Sen's body was, it couldn't withstand that type of collision for long. Han Sun was doing his best to cast his Geno arts. He needed to get the messed up powers back into their rightful places. But he quickly realized it would be almost impossible. When he cast the Blood Pulse Sutra, it made the Blood Pulse Sutra's power so strong, the other 3 powers would gather and counter it. The constant surge of powers made it difficult for Han Sun to get back on track. Casting the other 3 Geno arts led to a similar result. Han Sun could only cast 1 Geno art at a time too. He had no way of casting all 4 at the same time. His Geno arts were in chaos as they sought to balance themselves out. Han Sun was left unsure of what to do. Try as he might, he couldn't find a way to make them all work together. I have to take a risk. Han Sun could feel his body growing more damaged with every passing second. If he didn't find a way to bring his powers under control and get them back on track, he would probably end up dying at the hands of his own abilities. Han Sun didn't have time to second-guess his decision. He split his mind into 4, and he cast the 4 Geno arts at the same time. He wanted to control the 4 Geno arts simultaneously and put them back on track, so he would be able to maintain the balance of the 4 powers. He had only managed to cast all 4 Geno arts at the same time once before. Han Sun hoped to replicate that moment and enable his 4 Geno arts to run together. That was his only hope for putting them back on a normal track. Han Sun quickly discovered that casting 4 Geno arts at the same time was a difficult thing to do. Before Han Sun's body was injured, casting the 4 Geno arts wouldn't have been as difficult. But now, his pulse had been badly damaged. Plus, the 4 powers were messed up. Pulling the Geno arts back into rhythm would be harder than casting them had been before. The instant that Han Sun cast his 4 Geno arts, he felt the conflict inside his body grow even more severe. Now the powers were tearing even deeper into his body. The pain was like having his heart and lungs ripped loose. Han Sun couldn't suppress a scream. It felt like his pulse, his vessels, and his organs were being torn to pieces by some wretched power. He knew he couldn't stop though. He had to put those 4 powers back on the right track. If he didn't, it would be a miserable ending that awaited him. Han Sun held strong against that pain, and he continued trying to cast the 4 Geno arts. He wanted them to go back to normal, but every time he cast them a little, his body became more and more injured. Blood was pouring out of his wrecked flesh. Immortal Dragon. Han Sun's heart leaped. The black crystal came out of his sea of soul, looking like the immortal dragon. It began using its immortal substance chains to fix up Han Sun's body. Han Sun's body was being torn apart, but the immortal dragon was fixing it just as fast. Han Sun held strong against his pain and focused his mind on forcing the 4 Geno arts back into order. The entire process was excruciating. Anyone with a poor will would have failed. Han Sun struggled to hold strong against the pain that felt like his heart was being torn apart and the flesh was being scraped off his bones. He was slowly guiding the 4 Geno art powers back onto the right track. Fortunately, the immortal dragon had strong healing power. Otherwise, even if Han Sun had been able to hold on against that pain, his body would simply have been ripped to pieces. After 1 hour of torture, Han Sun finally put the 4 Geno arts back onto the right track. But that wasn't the end of the matter. Once the 4 Geno arts were put onto the right track, they kept running at an insane speed. They began to generate their prototype substance chains again, and Han Sun started leveling up to deified once more. Han Sun realized that he had fallen into an endless cycle. His body had fulfilled the requirements for becoming deified. In any normal situation, he would already have ascended, but the powers of his 4 Geno arts were all trying to become deified at the same time. When they leveled up, they each needed his body to support their development. Each power tried to take over his body completely. That was why there was conflict, and that was why he had failed to level up the first time. Fixing his body would lead him to leveling up, but attempting to level up would always end in failure. If this kept going, Han Sen would die eventually. Even his powerful will couldn't sustain him forever. Han Sen tried to cast only one Geno art, so that it could become deified. But he couldn't do it. That was because his body had reached 100% deified progress. It was forcing all 4 of Han Sen's Geno arts to activate. His body wanted him to level up completely. It wasn't possible for him to suppress all but one Geno art. It was like a baby growing. It was impossible for the baby to only grow one arm or one leg. A child couldn't let one limb develop, but forbid another part to grow. Now Han Sen's situation was like that. He was leveling up completely. He couldn't choose a particular part of himself to ascend. If he leveled up, everything about him would become deified. If I can't suppress 3 of my Geno arts, I will have to let all 4 become deified. After Han Sen thought about his situation, he realized that he had to take the risk and try. He wasn't going to back out now. But on the final step, as the 4 Geno arts tried to use his body to become deified, the powers conflicted. Han Sen failed again. The powers of the Geno arts were thrown into disarray, and the forming substance chains collapsed. Han Sen experienced a pain that almost broke his body. No. If this continues, I will not succeed. Han Sen held firm against the pain that wanted to tear his body to pieces. Many ideas flew through his head as he considered how he could let the 4 Geno arts run and become deified. Based on what he knew of evolution, there was no possibility of Han Sen becoming deified now. That was because the 4 Geno arts couldn't become one, and neither could they evolve individually. While using only a portion of Han Senator, they had to take over Han Sen's body completely. That was a contradiction that couldn't be solved. Wait a second. According to the theory, spell itself has a life force. She has a complete body structure and cycle. Maybe that will really work. Han Sen's brain flashed with an idea. He used the power of the immortal dragon again. Gritting his teeth through that unbearable pain, he shoved the 4 messed up Geno art powers back on the right track. The pain he experienced was worse than death. It was like being sliced to the bone a billion times. Han Sen didn't know if he could endure it, if he had to do it a second time. It must work. Han Sen felt his teeth chattering. He sent up a desperate prayer and then summoned spell. Chapter 2734 Leveling Up to Deified Spell took on her female form and appeared in front of Han Senator in a moment. She had rushed into Han Sen's body and combined with him. And then, Han Sen's body underwent some amazing changes. After he successfully combined with spell, Han Sen's body restructured dramatically. He wanted to use the changes of his body to redirect the routes of the 4 Geno arts. He hoped that doing so would let him find a way for all 4 Geno arts to coexist at the same time. After spell fused with his body, however, Han Sen suddenly noticed that the changes in his body's structure went far deeper than he had imagined. All 4 Geno arts were thrown off the routes they sought, and their powers were disrupted. In this mess, the 4 Geno arts were leaking energy freely. They began searching for new routes to channel their power, and that sudden search created a small and temporary balance. Han Sen could barely keep up with what was happening in his own body though. Lines of power were running everywhere. In such a chaotic situation, Han Sen had no other choice. He needed to keep running the powers of the 4 Geno arts. It was his only chance of progressing. To Han Sen's surprise, he discovered that after he combined with spell, the compatibility of his powers seemed to have increased. The 4 powers were running together without conflicting, especially the story of genes. After Han Sen combined with spell, the story of genes became very tame inside his body. It was like a placid lake that had always been inside him, and wherever the power flowed, chaos would slowly fade away. Any places in his body that didn't have power were gradually filled up by it. The Dongxian Sutra's power reacted in an even more unique way. It separated itself from Han Sen's body, confining most of its energy to the Dongxian armor. Between the Dongxian armor and Han Sen, a special cycle was running. The powers of his blood and bones became Han Sen's primary strength. While the substance chains were generated, they kept pushing Han Sen's body toward deified class. Finally, the 4 Geno arts were able to generate substance chains again, all while Han Sen's own body was trying to hit a deified level. Hansen knew he was at a crucial point. If he failed again, he didn't know if he could endure the searing pain another time. The 4 Geno arts suddenly formed a substance chain, 4 different powers combined, melting into Hansen's body. Hansen couldn't control himself. He arched his back and roared to the sky. The cells in his body quickly changed. At that moment, 4 different Geno arts created an amazing rhythm, as their structures became one. Their power bloomed like a flame being struck from a match. Their powers weren't truly combined, but they were now like a machine composed of 4 parts. Although they remained individual powers, they were all working together. The black armor was strong and beautiful, boiling blood ice and jade-like flesh. Hansen felt as if he had leveled up. That feeling was indescribable. A flaming, black substance chain rose from Hansen's body, making him look like a scary xenogeneic demon god. Even his presence looked like a xenogeneics. God body evolution complete. Battle body leveled up to deified class. When Hansen heard the notification, informing him he had successfully leveled up, he checked out his information. Hansen, Super God Spirit Body Gene Battle Body. Xenogeneic, Primitive Level, Deified Percentage, 0% Lifespan. 2658. Did these 4 Geno arts combine into one? Hansen saw that his gene battle body was listed as xenogeneic, and the 4 previous battle bodies were gone. Hansen's heart jumped. He tried to pull spell out of his body, and when he did, he felt as if some balance within his body had broken. The Geno powers cracked apart from each other, weakening Hansen's power. Although his power was weaker, he wasn't pulled out of deified class. He still had a substance chain power. Hansen looked at his information, and he noticed his gene battle body was broken into 4 familiar sections again. Mutant Blood Primitive, Jade Skin Primitive, Dongxian Sutra Primitive, Spell Primitive. The 4 of these battle bodies were the same. They had all reached primitive class. The reference to the xenogeneic battle body had vanished. Weird. Hansen shook his head at the strangeness of the situation. But before he could figure out exactly what was going on, the small jade figure started to shiver and shake. Liqueur and Exquisite were on their way. Regretfully, Hansen swam toward the surface of the Good Fortune pool. Hansen breached the surface, and after coming out of the water, he found Liqueur and Exquisite standing near the hall's door. They were with Shale and Li Chunxiu. All 4 people were staring at him. You really became deified? Exquisite and Liqueur looked at Hansen in shock. When they received the news from Li Chunxiu, they hurried over with haste. They had only just arrived there, and they saw Hansen emerge from the Good Fortune pool. They found powerful substance chains radiating from Hansen's body. He was deified. Li Chunxiu looked upon him very strangely. He had been waiting for Hansen to come out of the Good Fortune pool for too long. That was why he called Exquisite and Liqueur. He wanted them to sense Hansen's mind and find out what was going on down there. But who would have known that as soon as Liqueur and Exquisite arrived, Hansen would come out of the pool, and he emerged as a deified. This was all too strange. Li Chunxiu couldn't even begin to guess how Hansen had done this. A half-deified had remained inside the Good Fortune pool for 7 hours. He had triggered countless weird visions. And on top of that, he had become deified. That wasn't what Li Chunxiu expected. Hansen, you really became deified? Shale asked Han. Senator Hansen laughed and said to Li Chunxiu, "Thank you for giving me a chance inside the Good Fortune pool, sir. Had you not done this for me, who knows when I would have leveled up to deified. This is perfect. Now you and I can fight fairly." Shale's eyes were aflame with the idea of the fight. Is it appropriate to do it here? Hansen was eager to flex his new deified powers, but this was the Good Fortune pool. It wasn't an ideal battleground. Go to the valley, Li Chunxiu said coldly. Then he teleported away. Exquisite and Liqueur rounded on Han. Senator. They looked at him with anger, saying, "You became deified without calling us? I did not expect to become deified inside the Good Fortune pool. It was all just a happy little accident." Hansen spread his hands innocently. He had hoped to level up the Blood Pulse Sutra and Jade Skin to half deified. He had never expected that he would suddenly become deified. His becoming deified was something of a surprise. Let's go. Let us see how strong you have become, now that you are deified. Exquisite walked over to Han Sen and put a hand on his shoulder. They teleported into the valley. Chapter 27:35 Star Explode. Han Sen was no stranger to the valley. The last time he had been there was during the Silkworm bout. Now that he was back in the valley, Shale was his opponent once again. But things were different this time. Han Sen had changed a lot since their first fight. He had become deified. Shale wasn't the same person Han Sen had fought the first time, either. He had learned many more Geno arts in the interim. Although there were still flaws in his execution of certain skills, he was stronger than he had been. Li Chunxiu stood outside the valley, but his eyes never left Han Senator. He knew it was even more unlikely that Shale would win this time. He hadn't thought that Han Sen would become deified so soon. So Li Chunxiu wasn't expecting Shale to take part in a fight already. He hadn't completed his instruction of Shale. The Geno art Shale needed to learn took a long time to practice, especially when it came to fixing the issues arising from the simplicity of his previous skills. But this didn't matter at the end of the day. Real fights were how true fighters grew. Fighting an opponent like Han Sen would be beneficial for Shale's development. Li Chunxiu also wanted to know what Han Sen was like now that he was deified. In the valley, Shale looked at Han Sen and said, "I found a way to break your under-the-sky knife skill. You won't defeat me the same way this time." "I wasn't planning on using under the sky anyway." Han Sen smiled and summoned Spell's dual pistols. The dual pistols of Spell had become deified class now. There was even more detail in the engraving that covered the weapons, and the texture of the grips was even comfier. The two pistols were carved with mysterious flower symbols. "Let me try how strong Spell has become now that she's deified." Han Sen raised one of his hands and pulled the trigger. With a roar, a bullet went flying out the barrel and shot directly toward Shale. Shale remained still. Instead of attempting to dodge the bullet, one of his substance chains rose. He threw a punch to meet the bullet. Pang! The fist and the bullet hit each other, creating a scary impact. Shale's body was strong like a lion, but he was hit badly. His legs cleaved two long trenches through the earth as he flew back a few hundred meters. Shale's face changed. He turned his hand over to look at it, and he saw the bullet lodged inside one of his fingers. Blood oozed out from the bullet wound. Li Chunxiu frowned. Shale's power was the best out of all primitive deifieds. Yet with pure power, the lion-headed warrior was at a disadvantage. It appeared that he was much weaker than Han Sen, who had just leveled up. How can Han Sen be so strong? Li Chunxiu wondered to himself, turning his gaze back to Han Senator. Crystallizers were notorious for their poor fitness, but Han Sen's body was better than a born deified at the same level. This was so weird. Li Kier and Exquisite, on the other hand, were very happy. Han Sen had leveled up to deified, and he was so strong. He was stronger than any very high of the same level. This was very scary. What impressive power. Shale's eyes were on fire. While he watched Han Senator, his resolve for battle hadn't been lessened. Seeing Han Sen's strength had actually stoked a greater fire in his heart. Substance chains danced madly around him. The atmosphere sizzled like an unstoppable volcano that was about to erupt. Clearly, Han Sen's gun had triggered Shale's desire for victory even more. This explosion of power wasn't just pure force. It was a special skill. Shale has learned quite a lot of stuff recently. This will be a perfect way for me to gauge the extent of my deified power. Han Sen didn't attack. He was waiting for Shale to build up his strength first. Last time, Shale had lost to Han Sen because he didn't have a decisive power to beat him. That was why Han Sen had a chance to trigger a hidden ability of Under the Sky. After his failure, Shale had spent a lot of time thinking about how he might defeat Han Senator. He considered many different potential tactics. With Li Chunxiu's help, Shale settled on two different methods. One method employed a punching skill that was similar to Under the Sky. It was called Return to Origin. It could generate a lot of punching power, and it formed a scary punching light that flowed through the sky like a river. Using this, he could go against Under the Sky and trace its movements. The other method was known as Star Explode. For a short amount of time, this Geno art could greatly increase the fitness of Shale's body. His power and speed would receive a major boost. He could use the skill to defeat Han Sen through absolute sheer power. It would limit Han Sen's ability to use powerful knife skills. But Star Explode's weakness was its short duration. Because it was an exploding power, it would give Shale less than 10 minutes to beat Han Senator. If he couldn't beat Han Sen within 10 minutes, his body would become weak because he exploded too much. When Star Explode's power erupted, Shale's whole body shone with silver light. It was like a star exhausting all of its power in one burst. Everything outside of his body darkened against the background of his radiance. Han Sen, try out my punching skills. Shale roared and threw a punch toward Han Senator. He was still using his old punching skill. But it was so powerful that it seemed almost invincible. It was simpler than the last time it was used, but its power and speed had grown as well. He unleashed his punch, and his substance chains spread like the dust from a supernova. It was like that punch could destroy everything. No power could rival that almighty strike. That punching power carried the condensed light of 1,000 suns. Han Sen didn't choose to dodge it though. He straightened his arm in front of him, lifting one of his pistols into line with the incoming attack. That star-like power surged toward him. His finger calmly squeezed the trigger. Pang! The bullet streaked out of the barrel, shooting straight toward the massive incoming strike. Boom! A bright light exploded within the valley, blinding everyone who was watching the fight. For several long moments, no one could see anything. When the light finally dimmed a bit, they could see what had happened. Their faces went blank. Han Sen's bullet hadn't been stopped by Shale's punching power. It slid straight through the stardust to strike Shale's fist again. But after passing through the star explosion, the bullet had become weak. It hit Shale's fist, but it hadn't hurt him as the first bullet had. It simply bounced off and dropped to the ground. Although the bullet hadn't hurt Shale, its performance still left Li Chunqiu, exquisite, and Li Qier speechless. After Shale used Star Explode, his power had grown by an order of magnitude. One punch should have been able to destroy a deified at the same level. And the bullet that Han Sen used had been built from the power of a substance chain. It wasn't even solid. The fact that it could go against Shale's Star Explode without being destroyed was beyond shocking. My solidifying powers have become stronger. It generated a bullet that wasn't damaged by such a powerful explosion. I think it has reached an eternal level now, Han Sen complimented in his heart. Chapter 2736 Leftover Power. The desire to win that raged in Shale's heart was almost immeasurable. His scary punching powers came at Han Sen like a hailstorm. Han Sen kept firing his two pistols without reprieve, countering each of Shale's punching powers. No matter how strong Shale's punches were, none of them could come close to touching Han Senator. It had taken Li Chunqiu mere moments to confirm that when Shale used Star Explode, his power only equaled Han Senator. His expression looked strained, and he thought to himself, if this is Han Sen's base power, then that is too scary. Li Qier and Exquisite were even more stunned, because they knew for sure that they were only seeing Han Sen's base power. He wasn't using a power-enhancing Geno art like Shale was. His base power was enough to fight back Shale's Star Explode. That was almost unbelievable. In truth, Han Sen thought this was an expected result. After all, his 4 top Geno arts had all reached a deified level. Each Geno art had the power of a deified, and he had 4 of them reinforcing the same body. Their additions to his power weren't merely additive. As time went by, Shale was getting stronger and stronger. His body shone with ever-increasing starlight, but his punches were still being negated by Han Sen's bullets. The 10 minutes were flying by, and Shale's skin was starting to crack and bleed. It didn't look like he was going to last long. Han Sen, take my punch again. Shale roared. He punched toward Han Sen like a raging madman. The next second, Han Sen saw the valley before him fill up with an uncountable number of suns. The punching power was like an entire constellation exploding. Return to origin under Star Explode. Even a larva deified elite would have reason to fear that blow, Li Chunqiu thought to himself. Shale's performance was greater than he realized. Beneath Star Explode, he could still perfectly activate a punch using Return to Origin. Shale's power and talent were truly excellent. Han Sen saw the punching power washing toward him like a flooded river. He didn't plan on falling back though. He combined his two pistols to form another weapon. It was a rocket launcher. Han Sen lifted the launcher in his arms. He took aim and fired a rocket at the Star River-like punching power. A beam of light was emitted from the launcher, and it went soaring into the center of Shale's attack. No matter how strong that rocket is, it cannot go against return to origin while it is fueled by Star Explode, Li Chunxiu thought to himself. The next second he froze. The rocket slammed into the center of that stream of punches that was like a river of stars, and then it detonated like a nuclear bomb. The explosion consumed every bit of Shale's punching power. Boom! The following eruption looked as if it could melt the entire universe. Inside that beautiful example of Star Explode, there was too much light for the observers to look. They couldn't see anything. When the lights of the explosion receded, Li Chunxiu saw Han Sen and Shale still in one piece within the valley. But an enormous crater had been torn into the stone of the valley between them. Han Sen didn't attack, and Shale didn't attack either. But everyone knew Shale had already lost. His Star Explode time was up. He didn't have the power to fight Han Sen anymore. I lose, Shale admitted honestly. But Han Sen could tell that the man still wanted to fight. He wasn't going to quit because of a one-time failure. Li Chunxiu didn't say anything. Han Sen really had won. Anyone could tell Han Sen had far more power than Shale. It wasn't a victory that Han Sen had pulled off by the skin of his teeth. But Li Chunxiu was confident that if he had more time to raise Shale to the peak of his power, he would have a chance to beat Han Senator. But the very high man had to admit that Han Sen was strong right now. In fact, the crystallizer was stronger than he had imagined. He thought Han Sen was below Shale and Yu Shanshin. But now, Han Sen's battle power was clearly no weaker than theirs. He was possibly stronger. Combat power doesn't mean anything. The most important thing is the ability to become a true god. Shale is a fake 11 armor talent. There is a high chance he can become a true god. That will be the real victory. Li Chunxiu stared at Han Sen, then left the area with Shale. You became deified without informing us. How do you plan on paying us back for this? Li Kier smiled at Han Sen as she spoke. I will do whatever you want me to, Han Sen said while spreading his hands. I want you to stand facing a wall, Li Kier said, acting angry. I'm a grown-up, not a 3-year-old. Punish me another way, Han Sen said with a wry smile. Only kids would be punished by having to face a wall. No, you have to face the wall. And you have to face the wall for a whole month, Li Kier said with a smile. Han Sen frowned in annoyance. He wanted to say something, but Exquisite interrupted. Stop arguing. Little sister said you should face a wall because after a silkworm becomes deified, they have to go to the ancient wall. That will be good for all of us. I see. Han Sen just realized Li Kier wasn't really being petulant. She was just teasing him. But you have just become deified. You can go there in a few days. You should visit Bauer and spend some time with her first. You won't see her for a whole month while you're at the ancient wall, Exquisite said. Han Sen nodded, and then Exquisite took him back to the star tree. Because of what happened before, Li Kier and Exquisite no longer dared to leave Han Sen's side. One of them always remained by Han Sen's side in case something big happened. That made him super depressed. He didn't have any free time anymore. I really can't look like I'm too special. Otherwise, I won't have any freedom at all, Han Sen thought as he sat under the tree and drank a cup of tea. Exquisite could see what he was thinking, but she ignored him and continued reading a book. What are you reading? Han Sen asked, poking his head around next to her. Nothing. Exquisite snapped the book closed before Han Sen could see what it was. She placed it in her pocket and cleared her throat self-consciously. What is this ancient wall place that I'm going to? Although Han Sen was curious about what Exquisite was reading, if she wasn't going to tell him, then he wasn't going to keep asking. Exquisite quietly said, Ancient Wall is a place where one of my ancestors used to draw. Draw? Han Sen was surprised. Seeing Han Sen's surprise, Exquisite smiled and explained, It isn't an ordinary drawing. He was a famous genius of our race. Although he never became a leader, he studied the very high sense to a degree that no one else, aside from our alpha, has ever been able to match. After pausing, Exquisite looked up at the star fruit above them and said, Before he entered the Geno Hall, That elder sat before the ancient wall for 2 years. 2 years later, when he opened his eyes, the first thing he did was draw a picture on the wall. After he drew it, he flew away and went to the Geno Hall. The drawing has been there ever since. It is a legend, and not even now can people understand what that drawing is about. Chapter 2737 Ancient Wall. If no one can understand the meaning behind that drawing, what benefit can be gained from staring at it? Hansen asked, not understanding. Exquisite smiled and said, although the figure in the drawing is something no one can understand, the picture has the meaning and power of the elder that drew it. Just taking the time to study it will be beneficial for you. Now Hansen was able to understand. Exquisite and Li Qier wanted to let him experience the true God's art, because it would ultimately benefit them. Through him, they could understand it better and learn things from it. The experience would be beneficial to them all. So it wasn't a bad idea. But the ancient wall was a leftover from the very high ancestors. Ordinary outsiders weren't allowed to get close. Hansen and the silkworms could go there for a whole month after leveling up to become deified. But the rules still forbade Bauer, despite being a family member, from going there. Exquisite and Li Qier would be going to the ancient wall with Hansen, so they couldn't take care of Bauer. However, Hansen asked Bauer for her opinion. Bauer was willing to stay at the star tree, and so Hansen allowed her to remain there. With the Xenogeniacs there, Bauer wouldn't be too bored. When the three of them left, the six-eared macaque started to become excited. The six-eared macaque was a different kind of Xenogeniac. It was intelligent enough that it had pretended to obey Hansen as its master. But in truth it had just been observing. It wanted to find a way to escape from the star tree. The contract placed upon its body was very rigid, and the six-eared macaque couldn't find any way to remove it. If it escaped without removing the contract, it would still be restricted and oppressed by the forces of the contract. Hansen could easily take over its mind, even if he was far away from whatever system the monkey had hidden itself in. The monkey would be in agony until it did what it was told. If I want genuine freedom, I must break the contract. The six-eared macaque's eyes glowed, and it watched Bauer intently. The six-eared macaque already knew Bauer was Hansen's daughter. She was obviously very dear to him. Now Hansen wasn't around, and he wouldn't be for a whole month. If I can capture her, I can use her to threaten Hansen into breaking the contract. Hansen will have to do as I say. The six-eared macaque felt that his chance had come. The other Xenogeniacs follow her commands, but there is only one primitive deified in their midst. They have no chance of defeating me. That being said, I don't have to fight them. I just need to use my fake body, go invisible, and knock her out. The six-eared macaque was still forming his plan when he saw Bauer looking in his direction. The six-eared macaque was shocked. It thought Bauer knew that something was wrong, but then he heard Bauer speak from beyond her smile. She said, "Little Six, I'd like some of this fruit." The six-eared macaque really hated the name Little Six, but Bauer had called it over. It was the perfect opportunity. The six-eared macaque answered and quickly ran over to her. "Little Master, what would you like to eat?" The six-eared macaque watched Bauer carefully as she reclined comfortably. It was thinking, "This is perfect. I don't even need to be invisible. I will just deliver her the fruit, knock her out, and then stuff her someplace out of sight. That way, Hansen will be forced to break the contract with me. I want that." Bauer raised her finger to indicate the piece she wanted. She was wearing sunglasses while lying down on a chair. The six-eared macaque picked up a fruit knife. He cut the fruit into little pieces, took a slice, and brought it over to Bauer. He stretched it toward her, preparing to make his move. Bauer looked at the six-eared macaque. She didn't reach out and pick up the fruit. She smiled and said, "Did I say that I wanted to eat it? Give the food to the other. One each. No more and no less." The other, Bauer was talking about, would be the little pigs. They followed Bauer around, eating good stuff all day long, but their bodies never changed. They seemed as static and small as ever. "I'll cut your ass," the six-eared macaque suddenly shouted. It raised its claws quickly to snatch Bauer. As the six-eared macaque's claws were about to make contact with the pale, delicate skin of Bauer's neck, Bauer suddenly shone with a white light. The six-eared macaque's claws hit the light, spraying a fountain of sparks. The monkey's claws were unable to break through that defense, and its attack had been entirely blocked. The six-eared macaque was shocked. It leaned closer to take a look. The light didn't come from Bauer. It came from the little pigs around her. Right now, the 16 little pigs were standing alertly around Bauer. Their eyes were wide and unblinking as they stared at the six-eared macaque. Mysterious symbols glowed on their foreheads, and light shone from their bodies. The holy light of the 16 little pigs combined and transformed into a light shield that trapped the six-eared macaque inside. "You're just a bunch of pigs. You can't stop me," the six-eared macaque growled. It shone with a golden light of its own, and it slashed the light shield with its now glowing claws. Since it couldn't assassinate its target, the monkey would have to do this the hard way. The six-eared macaque knew Han's son wouldn't be back for a month, and it wagered it had enough time to capture Bauer. And in regards to the xenogeniacs and the 16 little pigs, the six-eared macaque cared little for them. But when its strike landed, the six-eared macaque noticed that its power wasn't enough to rip through the shield that encased it. The 16 little pigs were still holding it in place. None of them had gotten hurt. They all just stared angrily at the monkey. The six-eared macaque was shocked. It used its power again, hitting the light shield over and over. In growing astonishment, the monkey tried its hardest, but it was unable to break the shield of light. It really was trapped inside. "Little Six, you are such a naughty boy." Befuddled, the six-eared macaque watched Bauer stand up, take off her sunglasses, smile, and walk over to him. For some reason, the six-eared macaque felt a chill run down its spine. It had a bad feeling about this. Tang Minger had only just entered Star Moon Shelter when someone recognized her. "Tang Minger, are you Tang Minger?" A pretty boy wearing armor approached. He was riding a tiger beast soul mount. He was leading a group of knights, but he looked surprised as he stopped in front of Tang Ming. "I am Tang Minger. Who are you?" Tang Minger looked at the pretty boy. She tried digging into her memories, but she could not seem to recall who he was. "I am Ning Bueo." The pretty boy got off his mount and looked at her with glee. "Ning Bueo, you are Uncle Ning's son?" Tang Minger suddenly remembered. She had seen Ning Bueo a few times, but she had only been 7 years old at the time. She didn't remember him too well. The pretty boy in front of her did look like the boy she used to know as Ning Bueo. Ning Bueo looked passionate as he said, "Minger, your timing in arriving in Star Moon Shelter is most serendipitous. Since I am here, I can guarantee no harm will befall you. If you want any type of beast soul, just let me know. I will give you any in my possession. I even have sacred blood beast souls to give you. Sister Minger, you guys chat. I'm tired and need to rest." A voice sounded near Tang Minger. Ning Bueo saw she had a little boy next to her. Ning Bueo's brow furrowed. The boy only looked like he was 13 or 14 years old. He didn't look like he belonged in the sanctuaries just yet. Chapter 2738 Showing Off. I appreciate the offer, but those of the Tang family don't require protection, Tang Minger said unhappily. After all, Ning Bueo had spoken as if she was useless. That wasn't my intent. Our families are friends, so we should help each other out. Although Ning Bueo was cocky, he wasn't stupid. He realized that he had said something he shouldn't have, and so he quickly tried to steer the conversation back down a more pleasant avenue. "I understood your intent perfectly fine, but I don't require help," Tang Minger said. She took the boy's arm and said, "Little flower, let's go." When Ning Bueo saw the pretty girl he liked getting close to another boy, it upset him. He ran in front of the boy and pretended to be shocked. He asked, "What is your name, little bro?" "Han Little Flower," the boy answered while meeting Ning Bueo's gaze. When he heard the surname Han, Ning Bueo felt his heart take a huge leap. He was really afraid of that surname, due to something that had happened to him when he was younger. There was a time, on a beach, when a little demon girl belonging to the Han family had lobbed him into the briny depths of the sea. Even now, Ning Bueo continued to have nightmares about that terrible incident. It was the most terrifying memory he had. "Han Little Flower," he said. "I don't think such a person belongs to the Han family. Maybe he's a member of some other family with the same surname. Ningbueo dug into his memories and felt some relief. As long as Little Flower wasn't from that Han family, then he didn't need to worry. As far as Ningbueo knew, the Han family only had a daughter. She was only a few years old, so there was no chance she had entered the sanctuaries just yet. The legends said that the Han family did have a son, but for unknown reasons, the son had gone missing. Ningbueo remembered that the boy was called Han Fei. He didn't have an old-fashioned and funny name like Little Flower. Little Flower was just his nickname though. His family members called him Han Little Flower, but ordinary people would only know him as Han Fei. It was no surprise that Ningbueo failed to recognize the name. Brother Little Flower, if you need anything just ask. I Ningbueo am very talented. It is easy for me to kill xenogenics. Killing sacred blood creatures is a piece of cake for a guy like me. Ningbueo smiled at Han Little Flower as he boasted. Thank you. You seem like a nice guy. I will ask you if there is anything I ever need. Han Little Flower said politely. In Sacred, Auntie May had taught Little Flower to be polite with other creatures. Even when he was eating, he had to act like the gentleman he was. He had to keep up good etiquette at all times. What are you waiting for? I found a sacred blood creature to the east side of the shelter. I'm going to kill it. Let's go. Ningbueo said with a smile. He was very confident about his appearance and power. He thought he would only need to flex his powers for a little girl like Tang Minger to fall for him head over heels. Han Little Flower wasn't interested in killing sacred blood creatures though. He had only stayed in the first sanctuary because he was having trouble finding more super creatures. If he could find them more reliably, he would be in the second sanctuary already. Little Flower, if Mr. Ning is inviting you, we should go. Tang Minger suddenly winked at him. She was a smart girl, so she knew what Ningbueo was up to. He obviously had a thing for her. She also knew the Ning family were a very arrogant and self-loving set of people, overall. If she didn't sort out this trouble now, the way Ningbueo was annoying her would just snowball. That was why she said they should go, despite secretly harboring another reason for going. Ningbueo was happy to hear her agree. He summoned 2 sacred blood beast soul mounts and said, "The distance between us and that place is a bit far. I will give you these 2 sacred blood mounts as a gift." He was never hesitant about showing off. Ningbueo always thought if he had something decent, he should let other people know. Just talking wasn't enough, so he sometimes gave out gifts to demonstrate his wealth. 2 sacred blood mounts were something excellent. After all, there were many types of beast souls, so sacred blood beast soul mounts were quite rare. It is fine. Little Flower has a mount already. I will just ride it with him. Tang Minger smiled at Little Flower as she spoke. Han Little Flower didn't say anything. He just summoned his own ride. Boom. A giant gold, 2-headed dragon appeared in front of Han Little Flower. The mount beast souls around all started to scream and run away. If their masters hadn't commanded them to stop right where they were, all of them would have fled. Ningbueo froze when he saw it. It was a very powerful beast soul. He had seen things like this in his family's house, but they were high-class beast souls from the later sanctuaries. In the first sanctuary, he had never seen a beast that scary before. This cannot be a super beast soul. That is impossible. It's just a bluff surely. It cannot be a super beast soul. Ningbueo was really suspicious about its presence there, but he didn't want to ask what type of beast soul it was. Otherwise, it would make him sound like an ignorant redneck. Let's just go. Ningbueo had to force a smile as he spoke to Han Little Flower and Tang Minger, who were happily sitting on the 2-headed dragon's back. Please lead the way, Mr. Ning, Tang Minger said with a smile. Although he was upset, Ningbueo still commanded his team to go forward with haste. The sacred blood mounts ran as fast as they could, trying to leave the 2-headed dragon behind. But they had only just started running when the giant dragon spread its massive wings and soared off into the sky. It moved with incredible speed. Compared to the 2-headed dragon mount, Ningbueo's sacred blood mount was as slow as a turtle. That can't be a super beast soul, can it? Ningbueo was stunned. His mood was very sour, and he had to keep comforting himself, saying, "That kid must have just gotten lucky. Another family member might have just given it to him." In terms of power, he certainly can't compete with me. When I kill the sacred blood creature, Tang Ming'er will know for sure who the real man is here. The sacred blood mount moved reasonably quickly in comparison to most beast mounts. It took them 2 hours to reach their destination. They saw a creature there that was like a titan. It was resting quietly atop a hill. Ningbu Ao gave a command and sprang forward. He led his team to fight that sacred blood creature. The sacred blood creature stood up and roared when Ningbu Ao's army surrounded it. It couldn't get clear, and it was quickly hemmed in on all sides. Ningbu Ao's soldiers moved with great coordination as he issued commands. The sacred blood creature was unable to harm a single one of them. Ningbu Ao was very active too, and he attacked the sacred blood creature again and again. It took them half an hour to bring the titan down. Ningbu Ao was very satisfied with his performance. He had fought and commanded his men to the best of his abilities. He was very satisfied with how the fight had gone. He smiled at Han Littleflower and Tang Ming'er. He began walking toward them, but after a few steps, he heard an angry roaring coming from the sky. He raised his head, and his face paled. This new creature was similar to the sacred blood one they had just killed, but this one was bigger. It was like a small mountain. It fell toward them out of the sky. Ningbu Ao's soldiers were still reveling in the joy of their victory, unaware of what was going to happen. If the creature landed, half of them would die. Run! Ningbu Ao shouted as he started to run. But the normal soldiers didn't react as fast as he had. As he looked up at the giant beast about to crush them all, Ningbu Ao was shocked and furious. He couldn't do anything. Suddenly, something flashed in the corner of his vision. The giant beast coming down from the sky jerked to a stop. Its descent was halted. Ningbu Ao was shocked. His eyes tracked down the body of the behemoth until he saw Littleflower standing beneath it. The boy was holding up the mountainous beast with one hand. He stood there casually. The soldiers all around were staring at him in dumbfounded awe. They looked at the little boy holding up the beast like they were seeing a ghost. Chapter 2739 Weird Scene. Han Sun had expected the ancient wall to be a mysterious place, but quite surprisingly, it was just an ordinary wall atop a mountain. Aside from the many drawings that covered the wall's surface, it was nothing special. The pictures were admittedly strange. Han Sun and the two women passed through many restrictions to get there. But if they hadn't, Han Sun would have thought that these drawings had been created by some renowned abstract painter or graffiti artist, rather than by an ancient elite. When they arrived at the ancient wall, many of the very high were at the wall already. Some were sitting, some were standing, some were staring at the wall, and some had their heads lowered in contemplation. It seemed as if they were all trying to feel something from the paintings on the wall. Some of the very high who were present were very scary individuals too. Even among their powerful race, they were probably considered top-class elites. Han Sun started to say something, but Exquisite gestured for him to remain silent. She gravely placed a finger over her lips, then motioned for him to observe the painting. When Han Sun saw how Exquisite and Li Qier were carefully watching the very high around them, he realized that the two women must be trying not to disturb their prestigious elders. They were being very careful not to do anything that might disturb the other people at the wall, or disrupt their concentration. Han Sun didn't say anything. He just moved to examine the drawings on the wall. Exquisite and Li Qier stayed beside him, looking closely at the drawings as well. As they tried to understand the drawings, they also paid attention to what Han Sun was thinking. Being able to access Han Sun's perspective and knowledge meant they could learn much more. But it wasn't as if they were taking advantage of Han Senator after all. Had he not become a silkworm of the very high, he would never have been able to see the drawings on this wall in the first place. The whole mountain was covered in drawings, which meant that there was an unimaginable amount to take in. Han Sun wanted to find the very beginning. Once he found the starting point, he could follow the drawings as they progressed. But after searching for a while, he was unable to find where the drawing had begun. The weird artwork was something Han Sun couldn't understand in the least. Many abstract images seemed to have been melded together into a single fluid mural, which had no beginning and no end. It was hard to tell what it could all mean. If the drawings hadn't been so incredibly smooth and stunning, Han Sun would have thought that it was the random graffiti of a child. Exquisite could feel what Han Sun was thinking. She lowered her voice and whispered to Han Sun, "No one knows where this painting starts, and no one knows what the painting means. You should start by trying to understand it through the scratches." Han Sun nodded without responding. He couldn't see any obvious clues, so he did what Exquisite had suggested. He focused on the scratch marks visible in the stone. Han Sun's mind wasn't any worse than that of an ordinary deified elite. After looking over the drawing for a while, Han Sun realized that it had been drawn with a person's fingers. The mind that resided inside the scratch marks wasn't hostile, either. These weren't the gashes of weaponry, but neither were they elegant like writing done with a pen. It was a very strange thing to see. This should be a finger mind, Han Sun guessed. He couldn't be entirely sure though. Although he wasn't sure what kind of mind this was, it wasn't hard to tell that the person who made the entire drawing had a powerful consciousness. Han Sun's mind was powerful in its own right, but compared to the mind that had created these marks, his was simple and low-level. Han Sun wasn't in a rush to understand the mind that resided within the marks. He followed a trail across the mountain. First, he wanted to take in the drawing on a larger scale. After that, he would step closer and examine each individual drawing in detail. But no matter how hard he tried to see and understand, he couldn't get the gist of any painting or drawing. He couldn't even glean a clue. He had to start from the scratch marks again. The mind in the carving was left behind by the very high who used his powers to draw. I think that the messages left behind by the drawing and the scratch marks themselves are different. Revealing the secrets of the painting wouldn't help me understand the mind carved into the rock. But then again, no one expects me to reveal the secrets of the painting. If I can understand the meaning of the scratches, then this entire venture will be worthwhile. Han Sun grew calm and focused on trying to understand the meaning of the lines. The marks gave Han Sun the impression of drifting clouds, but as his understanding of the marks deepened, it made him think of an unstoppable force. It gave him the desire to delve deeper into the depths of his own emotions. It was the feeling of someone who loved reading books, but then they discovered the most spellbinding novel in existence. Han Sun was drawn to it, and he didn't want to tear himself away from the tale for a single second. He just wanted to keep reading and find out what happened next. The second impression he gleaned was the word strange. Every mind tended to have a theme. In Han Sen's Under the Sky, for example, the theme was that everything in the universe was just a chess piece. But the mind in this painting was unique. If you described an ordinary person's mind, you could say it was like a tree, a mountain, or a river. But if those things represented ordinary minds, then the mind of this painting would be like a scroll that was 10,000 miles long. Every line and every curve had a different mind. One section could be a mountain or a body of water. Another part might be a cloud or a speck of soil, or a pavilion or a building. A single curve of the drawing could be a flower, a bird, a bug, or a fish. The changing of the minds drew the observer in further and further, leaving them unable to stop. With a single step, Han Sun could witness 3 different scenes. Every line and every turn filled him with amazing thoughts. It left him unable to guess what the next scene might be. No wonder Exquisite said any creature that visited the ancient wall would receive a boost to their mind. The mind on this wall seems to encompass everything. Any creature that practiced any power or element could find a mind there that matched well with their genoarts. Although Han Sun was looking at it with his own eyes, it was rather difficult to believe. Han Sun wondered what sort of genius this very high elder must have been to be capable of drawing a painting like this on his own. If the very high hadn't confirmed that the ancient wall's drawings were done by one person, Han Sun would have thought that this drawing was the work of many people. How could one person be the master of so many minds? It didn't make sense. Even though Han Sun had a voracious intellect and an impressive ability to learn, he could only walk one path. He couldn't learn everything there was to be learned in the universe. If this was drawn by one person, then that very high elder's mind is very impressive. He must have been the smartest person in the whole universe, Han Sun murmured as he examined the drawings. Han Sun continued working his way through the drawings, one by one. Although he couldn't learn all of it, Just feeling all those kinds of minds was good for expanding his own knowledge. It was helping him develop new perspectives. Han Sen was continuing his observations when he was delivered a shock. Goosebumps flared across his skin at the sensation. This mind was simply too twisted and weird. As he explored, Han Sen had felt too much of the mind and realized that it was too complicated. He was sinking into it, which shook his faith to the core. It was like a university student who had just graduated. Countless large companies sent invitations to the graduate. One of them said, "Come to my company and be a lawyer. Being a lawyer has all sorts of benefits. You will earn a lot of money." Another company said, "Come to be a doctor in my company. Being a doctor can make you incredibly famous, and your reputation will grow by leaps and bounds." Everyone said they were the best, and all of them seemed generous and attractive. A new graduate, being pulled in so many different directions, could quickly lose track of themselves. Chapter 2740. In the painting, unless someone possessed a very stable will, they would lose themselves without even noticing what had happened. But in this case, losing oneself wasn't a bad thing. When people were uncertain of which path they wanted to traverse in their life, they could lose themselves in the drawing and choose a mind to complete their purpose. For people who were still establishing their own identity, finding a mind within the drawing that they could claim as their own could help them in the future. Han Sen was different. He already had a path to walk, and if he allowed himself to be influenced by the mind of the drawing, the core of who he was would be destroyed. Han Sen forced himself to close his eyes and escape the grasp of that mind, but all sorts of minds rose against him, trying to keep his vision fixed on the drawing. Fortunately, Han Sen had a very stable will. He was able to tear his gaze away from the wall. He slowly soothed his mind. Having the ability to turn away from the ancient wall with a single try proves that your mind isn't bad, said a voice beside Han. Senator Han Sen opened his eyes and turned to the speaker. There he saw a middle-aged man sitting on a stone. The man was looking in Han Sen's direction. This middle-aged man's appearance and clothing were fairly unremarkable, but there was something about his presence that captured Han Sen's attention. It made him a difficult person to ignore. "Are you talking to me?" Han Sen was confused, not knowing who the man was. Han Sen had been so engrossed in the drawing that he had walked quite a distance. Exquisite and Li Qier were still a ways behind him, so there was no one else around that the man could have been addressing. Exquisite and Li Qier had been drawn into the mind on the ancient wall. They were too absorbed to pay attention to anything else, so they hadn't noticed when the man addressed Han Senator. They were totally drowned in the mind of the ancient wall. The middle-aged man laughed and said, "Aside from you, I don't think anyone else has made it all the way here on their first try. Right. After all, geniuses like me are difficult to come by," Han Sen said, quirking a smile as he touched his nose. The middle-aged man looked surprised, but then his grin widened. He stepped down from the stone he had been sitting on. He stood next to Han Sen, facing the ancient wall. The very high can feel everything. Even though this universe can be incredibly complex and intricate in nature, we can feel the core of every object. However, the ancient wall has been here for billions of years, and no one has been able to understand its secretive nature. Do you know why? I don't know why, Han Sen answered quickly. If he didn't know, there was no point in pretending that he did. The middle-aged man's question had been rhetorical. He nodded when he heard Han Sen's answer, and he looked at the ancient wall. He pointed to one spot in particular and said, "The reason no one can understand its secrets is because of this." Han Sen looked at where the middle-aged man was pointing, following the man's finger to a single symbol hidden among the rest. There was a horizontal eye in the center of the symbol, but the pupil of the eye looked like the yin-yang tai chi fish. "Is this the very high eye?" Han Sen asked with shock. The middle-aged man nodded and said, "This entire painting is so weird. No one can tell what it is trying to depict. This spot is the only place where the painting is clear. And what does it show? The very high eye. Everyone can understand this aspect, but no one can tell why there is a very high drawn here. And no one knows what its connection is with the rest of the drawing. You can use this as the beginning, but no one understands what it truly means." Han Sen looked at the very high eye, and the rest of the painting around it. He did think the drawing was very weird, and he couldn't imagine what it was supposed to be. But no one could tell what the connection between the very high eye and the rest of the drawing was anyway. The middle-aged glanced away from the ancient wall and let his gaze fall on Han Sr. Although no one can understand the secrets behind this drawing, that doesn't mean you cannot learn anything. The very high eye in this painting is very unique. Its meaning is completely different from the other marks. If you look closely, you might learn a thing or two about it. What do you mean when you say that it is different? Han Sen didn't understand what the middle-aged man meant, because the mind of the painting kept shifting. Every line and curve in this entire enormous drawing was unique. How could you look at any one particular part of the painting and claim that it was special? The middle-aged man fell silent, then said, "This elder was a genius who stood just below the leader. He practiced the very high sense to the max. He could sense everything in this world within his own chest. That was how he could draw a painting that included everything. Although the mind inside this painting seems capable of endless variation, it was produced using the very high sense. This mind came from the talents known as very high forget love, big love, and loveless. This mind is powerful and nuanced, but it doesn't include the elder's own emotions. Only this very high eye drawing is different. It was made using emotions that came directly from the elder. What kind of feeling does it possess?" Han Sen asked with curiosity. If he had developed the very high sense to a true god level, the very high elder must have almost reached sky and men combined together. He must have come close to uniting with the universe. Even Exquisite was nearly emotionless, and this man had practiced the very high sense that was far beyond Exquisite's abilities. It was hard for Han Sen to imagine what kind of emotions such a man would have been capable of feeling. He might have been completely emotionless. If the man had somehow retained the ability to feel, that would shock Han Sen a lot. "I cannot tell you. If you wish to know, you should look into it yourself," the middle-aged man said with a laugh. Han Sen's curiosity was piqued. He wanted to examine the mind of this very high mark. Suddenly, Han Sen thought of something. He turned around and asked the middle-aged man, "I wonder what your name is?" Han Sen assumed that this man hadn't practiced the very high sense, but even if that were true, the very high had many elites like that. After all, the very high could practice any Geno art to a higher level of skill than the other races of the universe. They would approach each new Geno art with no less aptitude than they applied to the very high sense. "Li Zi," the middle-aged man answered casually. The question didn't seem to bother him. "Thank you for the tip." Han Sen bowed and returned his attention to the very high eye. Now that he looked at it, Han Sen could feel the strong pull of the mark's mind. Just like Li Zi had said, the mind in this little part of the drawing was different from the minds that could be found elsewhere in the drawing. Once Han Sen was looking at it, he wondered how he had failed to notice it before. There was a stark contrast between the meaning of the eye and that of every other part of the drawing. Han Sen stared at the very high mark, his body completely unmoving. He was so still that he looked like a piece of the landscape. He didn't even blink. Not long later, tears suddenly began to leak from Han Sen's eyes. He didn't so much as twitch, however. He kept staring at the eye as tears rolled down his cheeks. The tears kept coming, soaking his face and wetting his clothes. He just stood where he was, observing the very high eye on the wall without blinking. And then, the wells of Han Sen's eyes seemed to go dry. Next, his eyes started to bleed. The crimson tears fell, tracing 2 tracks of red across his cheeks. Chapter 2741 Very sad scene. A deep, lonely sadness claimed Han Sen's brain. Although Han Sen knew that the emotion was not his own, he felt it sink deep within him. The sadness was as broad and powerful as the Yangtze, rolling forward with the steadiness and implacability of a river. The sensation rocked Han Sen. The sadness was clear, yet it wasn't a raw or passionate emotion. It wasn't painful like losing your family, and it wasn't the heartache of being betrayed by a loved one. It wasn't the soul-rending anguish of losing everything that you cherished. It just resided in Han Sen's chest softly. The ache was so gentle that sometimes, Han Sen could barely even sense it. It floated like a mountain stream, but there wasn't a single ripple to be seen. But this kind of sadness was subtly powerful, and it was infectious. It left Han Sen unable to do anything except cry his eyes out. He couldn't get a grip on his emotions, and he couldn't move his eyes away from the very high eye mark. He just stood in front of the stone wall, staring at the stone with eyes rimmed in blood. Han Sen's brain knew that if things continued like this, the blood in his body would run dry and he would die. But he couldn't move his feet to tear himself away from that sad scene. To one of the very high, who had practiced the very high sense to an average level, the emotions conveyed by a painting would be fairly weak. But to a very high that had practiced the very high sense to a high level, it would be confusing to see how much scary sadness could be conveyed by this piece of artwork. Why would this elder have felt so much sadness? He was already in the true God class. He was at the top level of the pyramid of universal power. What could make him this sad? This depression is too strange. It is completely different from any of the emotions that I have endured. It makes me think of the phrase, sadness that is greater than the heart dying. This sadness is a little like that. But then again, it isn't quite the same, Han Sen thought. This very high elder left all this behind before heading for the Geno Hall. Was his sadness related to the Geno Hall in some way? Han Sen thought about it a lot, but he couldn't come to a conclusion. Regardless, he couldn't rid himself of the infectious sadness. Even with Han Sen's strong will, he couldn't pull his eyes away from the drawing. Exquisite and Liquier had synced their minds to the ancient wall when they first arrived, so they had spent most of the trip ignoring the feelings Han Sen was sending to them. This sadness was too potent to be ignored, however, and so it managed to reach them. It pulled Exquisite and Liquier away from the ancient wall's minds. They were also infected by the sadness, and they soon found tears leaking down their cheeks. What is going on? Why is it so sad here? Exquisite's face suddenly paled. She felt the sadness, but at the same time she understood. Oh no! Han Sen has seen the ancient wall's very high eye mark. Liquier also realized what had happened. Her face looked haggard, and bloody tears fell from her eyes as she said, "How was he able to trigger the eye mind? I thought only the very high who had practiced the very high sense could activate it." Although Han Sen hasn't practiced the very high sense, his under-the-sky knife skills seem to emulate sky and man combined together. It is similar to the very high sense. Maybe that is why he was able to trigger the very high eye mind. But now isn't the time to discuss this. We must quickly find a way to pull Han Sen away from that mind. If we don't, he won't be the only one who is damaged by that mind. Exquisite's eyes were full of blood, and it was on the verge of spilling down across her face. How do we pull him away? The eye of the ancient wall is no joke. Even if we move his body away so that he can't physically see the mark, we can't stop the mind from dealing damage to him. And if we move him away, he might even get consumed by the mind. Don't you remember the stories? Liquier said. Exquisite didn't respond. She knew what Liquier meant. Anyone who triggered the very high eye mind had to make it through themselves. If they made it through, their proficiency with the very high sense would increase. But if they failed to endure it, their will would be destroyed by the sadness. It wouldn't be easy for them to recover. They might even end up crippled, unable to level up ever again. Some people had even died at the ancient wall, and no one had been able to save them. Stories were one thing, but facing the threat in real life was something else. If they didn't think of a way to break Han Sen free from the very high eye mind, both of their minds might be damaged by the overflow of what Han Sen was experiencing. They might not die from it, but they would be heavily damaged. Countless very high elders, who were all gifted and intelligent, had ended up ruined by the very high eye mind. The two women didn't think they were any better than the aforementioned very high seniors. And in addition, they weren't even deified. The two of them tried to walk over to Han Sen, but as they came nearer, they were completely entranced by the emotions of the wall. They stood there with their eyes bleeding. They couldn't drag their minds away from the drawings on the wall. Their strange situation quickly drew the attention of the other very high around the wall. Weird. They seemed to have been infected by the sad mind of the very high eye. What is going on? I didn't think they were close enough to trigger the eye. Didn't their masters teach them that after practicing the very high sense, they couldn't look at the eye on the ancient wall? No, they didn't see it. They must have been affected because their silkworm saw the eye. How is that possible? He hasn't practiced the very high sense. He shouldn't have felt anything if he looked at the eye's mark. A dozen of the very high were in front of the ancient wall, and they all stared at Han's senator. They understood the situation Han's son was in, and they registered that he was the one who had triggered the very high eye's mind. That had led to Likir and Exquisite being dragged into the crippling emotions with him. This is weird. How could an outsider who hasn't practiced the very high sense activate the very high eye mark's mind? This isn't the time for a research question. We have to find a way to pull him out of the mind. The eye mark is dangerous for anyone, but for Exquisite and Likir, it will be life-threatening. What can we do though? You know how powerful this mind is. Even if we move the silkworm elsewhere, we won't be able to stop the mind from consuming his consciousness. And if we move him, we might even disrupt his will and accelerate the process. The only way we can do anything is if the silkworm escapes the bonds of that mind on his own. How would that be possible? We are deified elites of the very high, and few of us can escape the power of the very high eye mind. This guy is just an outsider. That's the silkworm's only hope though. He has to do it himself. Even if Exquisite and Likir fight back the power of the mind, it would be useless. As long as he remains trapped, the sad mind will keep overflowing onto Exquisite and Likir. Chapter 2742 Trying the Poison. It's like we're seeing a ghost. How can something so strange happen? How can an outsider trigger the very high mind? There is nothing we can do to stop the eye mind. If we want to intervene, our only choice is to break the silkworm's stupid contract with Likir and Exquisite. Their bodies might be injured when we sever the link by force, but at least their minds won't be destroyed by that horrible mind. It looks like there is only one solution. A dozen of the very high spent half a day talking, but they could only come up with one solution. This solution would only save Exquisite and Likir though. It offered no help to Han Sr. There's no reason to hesitate. Let's get this done now, one of the very high said. He readied himself to destroy the contract binding Likir and Exquisite to Han Sr. Stop it, Uncle Nine, Exquisite said suddenly. Her will was drowning in the sea of sadness coming from the eye mind, but the feelings were being filtered through Han's senator. Her experience of the eye mind was a little diluted, so it wasn't as strong as if she was the one peering into the eye. Since Han Sen's will was still holding off some of the eye mind's power, she wouldn't lose herself to the sadness easily. Her mind was still aware. Exquisite, speak quickly. The ninth uncle was afraid Exquisite's mind would be conquered in a matter of seconds, so he told her to speak as swiftly as she could. Uncle Nine, please do not incinerate the contract we share with Han's son, Exquisite said. Why? The ninth uncle asked, looking at Exquisite. The very high were all in shock. I believe he can stop the invasion of the very high eye mind, Exquisite said as she gritted her teeth. She was in the middle of the sad mind, and just speaking those few words cost her a lot of strength. After hearing Exquisite's answer, the very high who hadn't practiced the very high sense were in shock. Exquisite, you think too highly of him. Even very high like ourselves cannot withstand the eye mind once it has entered our consciousness. He is just a silkworm from another race. Exquisite, I know how difficult it was for you to find a decent silkworm. But right now, you have to make a hard decision. A strong man breaking his wrists is a challenge that requires courage. Uncle Nine, please, Exquisite pleaded, summoning the last dregs of her energy to speak. She paid no attention to the other very high around them. As she spoke to the ninth uncle, the minor distraction allowed the emotions to encroach on her mind even more. She could no longer spare enough attention to listen to what was happening around her. Uncle Nine, you cannot listen to her. This will kill her. Yeah. An outsider that hasn't practiced the very high sense cannot block the very high mind. It will only end up hurting the girls. The very high did their best to convince him, but the ninth uncle frowned. Making this decision is Exquisite's right, and she has made up her mind. Some of the others who were present disagreed with the ninth uncle, but they didn't dare say anything. They merely shook their heads and sighed. If Exquisite isn't willing to cancel the contract, then we can at least break Li Qier's contract, someone suggested. The ninth uncle looked at Li Qier. Li Qier wasn't as strong as Exquisite, so fighting off the sad mind left her with no additional energy to pay attention to the world around her. She couldn't talk. Let's wait a bit longer. If that stupid silkworm can't hold the mind back, then we can get involved, Uncle Nine said coldly. The Very High could only watch and wait as Han Sun, Li Qier and Exquisite battled the sad mind. But among those who were watching, not even the ninth uncle believed that Han Sun had what it took to repel the Very High mind. Han Sun had just become deified, so his will should have been meager in comparison to the will of a true god. Secondly, Han Sun had never practiced the Very High sense. His resistance to the Very High Eye mind was even weaker than that of the Very High, so no one thought he could withstand the sad feelings emitted by the Eye mind. The Eye mind on the ancient wall was dangerous, but for the Very High that practiced the Very High sense, there was at least a chance. If someone could successfully fight off the sad mind, they would gain dexterity with their own use of the Very High sense. The Very High thought it was a shame that Han Sun wasn't one of them. He hadn't practiced the Very High sense, so even if he survived the Eye mind, he wouldn't gain benefits as others would. As Han Sun and the other two fell under greater and greater amounts of strain, bloody tears continued to gush out of their eyes. Everyone knew their time was almost up. If they didn't break free of the melancholy soon, the blood tears would run dry, and their bodies would break. Han Sun knew he had entered a very dangerous period of the fight. His will was incredibly strong, but he couldn't withstand the invasion of the sadness forever. The sadness was seemingly infinite. It just went deeper and deeper. He was starting to think that he was tired of living. If a deified of a weaker will had been in Han Sun's place, he would have slit his own throat by now. No, I cannot keep going like this. Han Sun knew that his current tactics weren't working, but this pure battle of mind versus mind wasn't something that could be overcome by power. He had to get by using his own will. Ever since he came to understand the mind of Under the Sky, Han Sun's will had increased in strength considerably, but he hadn't gained enough strength to directly oppose a true god mind. His will was slowly being invaded by the phantom opposition. It chipped away at his resolve, which began to falter and crumble. It made him feel as if he was going to drown in the sea of sadness. Han Sun was hoping that the black crystal armor would help. He had expected it to intervene a long time ago, but the black crystal armor hadn't moved a single inch. Therefore, Han Sun had to stand strong and fight his way through the pain with white knuckles. You can't get good help these days. I'll have to depend on myself once more. Something will appear. Han Sun was the type of man who grew calmer the more danger there was. Now his heart was completely unperturbed. He weighed his situation, and it made him think. If the Very High haven't set up restrictions to prevent people from seeing the eye mark, that means there has to be some way for me to fight back against the sadness of this mind. But what am I supposed to do against it? With my mind, going against the sadness face to face doesn't seem realistic. My only chance is to understand where this sad mind is coming from. If I can understand what inspired the Very High Elder's feelings, perhaps I will find a way to break it. When he came to this realization, Han Sun gave up on trying to fight back the sad mind. Instead, he tried to feel and analyze the origin of that mind and its emotions. Han Sun knew this would be dangerous. It was like he was holding a vial of poison, but he would have to taste it to learn its composition. Tasting it would increase his chances of death. Yet it was also the only way for him to figure out an antidote. Even the magical knives of the rebate were forged in a sea of fire. Han Sun was embarking on a treacherous path, but waiting around like a sitting duck wasn't his style. Just as Han Sun had noticed before, this sad mind wasn't related to romance, and not familial love either. Han Sun kept exploring the sadness, and he thought to himself, what kind of sadness is this? Chapter 2743 Finishing Himself. When the Very High named their skill Forget Love, they meant it literally. With this Very High Elder's level of advancement, he must have been very close to quelling all emotions within himself. What could possibly make an elite that had reached such a level so upset? Han Sen hadn't developed any Geno art to such an extreme level of proficiency, so he couldn't understand what that very high elder must have been thinking. Therefore, he had to risk poisoning himself by intentionally exploring the I mind. He needed to let himself go and dive into the sadness. He had been trying his best to fight off the sad mind, so he had only experienced the surface of the emotion. Now that he was letting himself go and allowing his mind to freefall into the sad mind, however, he could understand it at a deeper level. But the price he had to pay for that understanding was quite scary. In mere moments, suicidal impulses had passed through Han Sen 6 times. If I don't succeed this time, I'm afraid I will really end up killing myself, Han Sen thought to himself. But he didn't hesitate. He let go of his body and allowed the sad will to overtake him. Through the ages, many very high had triggered the I mark, and most of them started off like Han Senator. They chose to fight against the overwhelming sadness. Everyone knew that experiencing that level of depression was dangerous. The emotions of sadness ran way too deep, and anyone who experienced it for too long had a high chance of killing themselves. Even if someone was willing to completely let themselves go and learn all they could about the sad mind, there were limits. When they felt their wills grow weaker, and the thoughts of suicide started to come out in full force, they would turn away and stop trying. The very high that studied the very high sense were smarter. Rather than seeing the emotional dead ends ahead, they would press on until the end. They would find another way to get out of the emotional darkness. But Han Sen was different. He was a very stubborn man, and there was no way for him to retreat. He wasn't like the very high who studied the very high sense. Even if they didn't continue, they still had a chance of escaping with only a small amount of damage incurred. Now Han Sen would have to walk the full path. Even though he was fighting for his life with every moment that passed, he had to understand the real mind of the very high elder. The sad mind sank deeper and deeper into his own mind. Han Sen learned more and more. Han Sen never thought that such a pure sea of sadness could exist in the universe. It wasn't self-loathing or hatred of everything else in existence. Rather, it was a sadness that was more like mercy. When that realization flashed through Han Sen's mind, he jerked in surprise. Mercy for sadness. He had never thought of this before, but at this moment he truly felt it. His whole body was overtaken by merciful sadness. These are the last tears I will shed in this universe. In that infinite sadness, Han Sen heard a sound come from the nothingness. That sound was too dynamic to describe. Once he heard it, Han Sen's chest ached more deeply than he ever could have imagined. He wanted to drop to the ground and weep, but he knew that his tears of blood had almost run dry, and he couldn't cry anymore. After hearing the empty voice in his brain, Han Sen felt even sadder. This was a different kind of sadness than he had felt before, though. This sadness also made him feel helpless and lonely. The next second, Han Sen's heart was stricken with absolute fear. That was because he discovered that his sadness wasn't coming from the very high I mark. It came from himself. It was a paralyzing emotion, and it made him feel like he had lost the most important thing in his life. It felt like there was no point in living. He couldn't wait to kill himself. Han Sen slowly realized what was happening, but he couldn't control it. He felt more and more hopeless and lonely. He slowly raised his hand, ready to crush his own skull and kill himself. A dozen of the very high gathered near the ancient wall could see that the sadness Han Sen was fighting had intensified. They knew it was a bad sign. Li Qiu and Exquisite were in rough shape as well. Oh no! Han Sen has stopped resisting. The sad mind has overtaken his body. The ninth uncle's expression became grave. There was no need for him to say that, though. The others could tell what was going on. I can't believe Exquisite believed in him so much. He's going to give up so soon? A very high said angrily. You must consider that he is only an outsider, after all, someone said with a sigh. The very high who practiced the very high sense quietly looked at Han Sen and Exquisite. They were waiting for the moment to arrive. The ninth uncle was prepared. When that moment came, he would sever Li Qiu and Exquisite's contract with Han Senator. He would rather they be injured than killed. Indeed, not long after, what everyone expected finally happened. Han Sen raised his hands and moved them close to his head. Everyone could tell he wanted to kill himself, due to the influence of the sad mind. Almost at the same time, Likier and Exquisite raised their hands just like Han Sen had. They touched their foreheads, their faces utterly devoid of hope. The ninth uncle shook his head. He knew they had reached a point of no return. There was no reason to wait any longer. Han Sen was going to die, and Likier and Exquisite had to be saved. The Very High didn't have a large population. There were only a few hundred of them. They couldn't afford to lose two people. The ninth uncle raised his hands and summoned the power he would need to forcefully remove the contract binding Likier and Exquisite to Han Senator. Then he cocked his head to the side and looked at Han Senator. Everyone was waiting expectantly for the ninth uncle to save Exquisite and Likier. They were all looking at him, and they immediately noticed his strange expression. When they followed his gaze, they quickly realized that the ninth uncle was staring at Han Sen, and that Han Sen seemed a little different than he had been before. Han Sen had raised his hand to kill himself, and his face had been full of the emotions of death. Now his features showed that he was locked in an internal struggle. His hands were stopped halfway. He hadn't struck himself. There was something deeply disturbing about his expression. Exquisite and Likier were affected by Han Sen's emotions. Their hands had also stopped in midair. They were all frozen in place with faces full of conflict. Still struggling, the ninth uncle murmured to himself. Uncle Nine, stop hesitating. No matter how much that silkworm struggles, he cannot withstand the strength of that sad mind. He is going to die no matter what. Hurry up and disconnect the contract binding him, Likier and Exquisite. Yes, his death is inevitable. Hurry up and bring all this to an end. If Exquisite and Likier experience his suicide through their connection, it will be very traumatic for them. It will deal a lot of damage to their minds. As everyone discussed this, something weird suddenly happened to Han Sr. Chapter 2744 Sit and Forget Sutra. All signs of struggle disappeared from Han Sen's face, only to be replaced by total calm and serenity. His threatening hand was lowered. The most unusual thing about his calmness was his scary presence. When the Very High felt that presence, a chill passed through their hearts. Almost at the same time, Exquisite and Likier's faces relaxed too. Their bodies replicated Han Sen's movements, lowering their hands from their previously threatening posture. Why does this seem so familiar? This presence, one of the Very High mumbled with a far-off look. It isn't just familiar. This presence feels like the Very High sense. Why is Han Sen's body exuding the Very High sense? Another Very High asked, stumbling as he spoke. It isn't the Very High sense. The ninth uncle was giving Han Sen an inscrutable stare. Although the presence is similar, it isn't really the Very High sense. It must be a Geno art, that is a branch of the Very High sense. A Geno art that is an offshoot of the Very High sense? A bunch of the Very High looked at the ninth uncle. They weren't shocked, just confused. Many Geno arts had been derived from the Very High sense, including the textless Book of the Sky. There was nothing too strange about the concept of an offshoot Geno art. The strange thing was that despite all their collective knowledge and experience, they didn't know which of those Geno arts the ninth uncle was talking about. The ninth uncle's face looked conflicted. He stared at Han Sen for a while, and went on to say, if my guess is correct, this presence is Sit and Forget Sutra. It was created by our Alpha. When everyone heard this, jaws fell open all through the gathering. Even those who practiced the Very High sense couldn't keep their hearts calm. The Alpha that the ninth uncle spoke about was the Very High Elder, who had left the painting behind on the ancient wall. His most famous Geno art was the Sit and Forget Sutra, which was derived from Very High sense. The Alpha's Sit and Forget Sutra was lost, wasn't it? How can Han Sen have the Sit and Forget Sutra's presence? Is he? One of the Very High started to say. It was like he had thought of something too ludicrous to continue. He looked at the drawing on the ancient wall and said, was the Sit and Forget Sutra hidden here in the ancient wall all this time? This suggestion was met with resounding skepticism. After all, Han Sen was merely an outsider. He had never studied the Very High sense before, and so many Very High geniuses had failed to discern anything special about the ancient wall. Many of the very high were simply unable to accept that Han Sun, who was just an outsider, could learn the Sit and Forget Sutra through the ancient wall. Despite that, the truth of the matter was directly in front of them. They had to believe it. Han Sen's body was clearly exuding a presence that felt like the very high sense. Considering all the things that had just happened, it really might have been the Sit and Forget Sutra. It wasn't just Han Sun either. Even Exquisite and Li Qier were giving off the same presence. Clearly, they could feel through what Han Sun felt. They had earned the knowledge he had earned, receiving the mysterious Sit and Forget Sutra through him. Sit and Forget Sutra was made by the very high elder, but it hadn't been passed down through the generations like an ordinary Geno art. No one in the very high knew what kind of Geno art it was. After the Alpha created the Sit and Forget Sutra, he had spoken about it at length, but no one had ever seen him use it. Then the Alpha had gone straight to the Geno Hall. He didn't record anything about the Sit and Forget Sutra for the very high to study. Therefore, no one had practiced the Sit and Forget Sutra before. But after he created the Sit and Forget Sutra, the Alpha's presence had been different from the presence of the very high, who practiced the very high sense. This was recorded in the historical records of the very high. The ninth uncle was very familiar with those records, and he came to his theory based on what he sensed from Han Senator. That was how he identified the power, before him, as belonging to the Sit and Forget Sutra. The ninth uncle's judgment was correct. Han Sen's presence was the Sit and Forget Sutra, because extreme yang begets yin. When things reach an extreme, they tend to blow back. When the sad mind was pushed to its limit, Han Sen almost fell into a morbid realm of death. But he never lost his faith. He clung to a bit of his will, balancing himself through the loneliness and fighting back the death that sought him. Han Sen suddenly felt the sad will rumble with change. The changes were something not even he could understand. The sadness seemed to melt, and what replaced it was a calm sense of serenity not unlike water. Once that mind changed, Han Sen's will was no longer affected by the very high eye. Control of his own body returned. He looked away from the very high eye mark, and looked across the ancient wall near him. Now Han Sen saw the abstract symbols for what they were. They no longer seemed abstract or surreal. It was like he could see a white-haired very high man sitting cross-legged, releasing a weird presence. The eye symbol was the origin point, and he followed the strokes to learn more, as if he was watching a tutorial without sound. There were no sounds and no explanations, but for some reason, Han Sen was able to learn a lot just by looking at the drawing. The meaning of the artwork was fed straight into Han Sen's brain, as if he had already seen the drawing 100,000 times before. Han Sen stared at the ancient wall, segment by segment. He grew more and more excited the further he looked. The painting on the wall was indeed a very mysterious Geno art. He soon realized that this Geno art was better than any knife skill or punching technique he had ever learned before. The more Han Sen saw, the more shocked he became. And the more shocked he was, the greater his excitement grew. Even Under the Sky was so much less than the Geno art he was now studying. But Han Sen could also feel that the Geno art and Under the Sky each had some unique abilities. It felt like they came from the same origin, but they had been developed in totally different directions. Han Sen was so absorbed in studying the Sit and Forget Sutra that he didn't notice the very high around him. All of the onlookers had wide eyes, and they were staring at Han Sen, Li Qier, and Exquisite with looks of sheer disbelief. Their faces were full of shock, envy, jealousy, and a lot of emotion. Han Sen kept studying the picture, and his Sit and Forget Sutra's presence grew heavier. Anyone could tell Han Sen was learning the secrets of the Alpha. He had somehow opened up the mystery of the ancient wall's drawing. Just like the ninth uncle said, he must have indeed learned the Sit and Forget Sutra. And Li Qier and Exquisite must have learned Han Sen's Sit and Forget Sutra too. While Han Sen's knowledge expanded and deepened, the girl's Sit and Forget Sutra became grander as well. Many of the very high had believed that Exquisite's resolution to maintain her contract with Han Sen was a stupid idea. But now, they were beyond jealous of her. If Exquisite's contract had indeed been broken, she wouldn't have shared Han Sen's discovery of the Sit and Forget Sutra. That would have been the biggest loss in their history. It would have been unacceptable. Although Exquisite and Li Qier had both earned the Sit and Forget Sutra, the very high elites still found themselves staring at Han Senator and outsider Silkworm had learned one of the greatest secrets of the very high. And it was a secret their own people had failed countless times to uncover. And on top of that, the secret was related to the very high sense. The emotions they felt as they looked at Han Sun would have been very difficult to describe. Chapter 27 45 Different Path. Every aspect of the drawing flashed through Han Sen's brain with crystal clarity, helping him understand more and more about the Sit and Forget Sutra. It was different from Under the Sky. Sit and Forget Sutra was a completely unique path. Even to Han Sun, who had studied many different Geno arts, this skill was incredibly fresh and amazing. It was like opening the door to a new world. Exquisite and Li Qier were both stunned and deliriously happy. They could feel everything Han Sun was learning, and they gained new insights every time Han Sun understood something. They were beyond pleased with the incredible capabilities of the Sit and Forget Sutra. They both practiced the very high sense, so they knew how precious the Sit and Forget Sutra was. At the same time, they knew how hard it would be to truly learn the Sit and Forget Sutra. This was especially true for the very high, who had practiced the very high sense. For them, learning the Sit and Forget Sutra would be pretty much impossible. Throughout the years, many gifted very high would have been incapable of learning this Geno art, even if it was right in front of them. The Alpha had his reasons for not recording the Sit and Forget Sutra in the historical records of the very high. If those who had studied the very high sense practiced the Sit and Forget Sutra, the results would be disastrous for most of them. Unless they had already surpassed the larva rank and become deified butterflies. Learning the Sit and Forget Sutra might damage them instead of helping them. So the Alpha didn't leave his new creation behind. He drew it on the ancient wall, hoping that someday, a very high would fulfill the requirements to learn it. Although the Sit and Forget Sutra was derived from the very high sense, it was far more extreme than its Geno art progenitor. Unless someone could completely understand the Sit and Forget Sutra, the two Geno arts would immediately fall into a devastating conflict. The very high Forget Love still lent the word forget into the Sit and Forget Sutra. That made this Geno art very special. The ultimate goal of the very high sense was achieving sky and man combined together. All practitioners of the very high sense wanted to combine their universes into one, so they could achieve an understanding of everything between the sky and the ground. They wanted to control and rule the entire universe. But the Sit and Forget Sutra was completely different from this. Its practitioners sought to forget things in themselves. They had to let go of the universe, the sky, and the ground around them. Once they had completely abandoned the things that they once held on to, they could reach an existence that was free of all constraints. Because Han Sun had only learned the method for practicing this new Geno art, he wasn't sure yet what would happen when he used the skill. In truth, Han Sun and the two women didn't know exactly what benefits the Sit and Forget Sutra would offer them. But one thing Exquisite knew for sure was that if she had learned the Geno art herself instead of receiving Han Sen's knowledge secondhand, the Sit and Forget Sutra and the very high sense would have conflicted. She would have been destroyed as the two Geno arts went to war within her. Learning the Sit and Forget Sutra from one end to the other was the only way to find out that the Sit and Forget Sutra was the very high sense in reverse. When they were pushed to the max, the two Geno arts became essentially the same. Exquisite and Li Qier continued to learn, and the more they learned, the more they were shocked by what the Alpha had achieved. If they hadn't practiced the very high sense, they would have been as high as kites. So high it couldn't be described. No one else could have made this Geno art that was called Sit and Forget Sutra. BZZD. Han Sun looked at the final picture, and after he did, he felt as if his entire body had leveled up. Everything in the universe now looked different in his eyes. Nice things, evil things, love, hatred. Everything suddenly lost all of its importance. Everything seemed so still and calm that it couldn't be described. He had never known the true face of Lu Mountain, and fate only resided on that mountain. Humans were always trapped in the throes of love and hatred. It was because they were part of the game. They couldn't escape from it. Now Han Sun was feeling a bit different about things. It was like he had disconnected himself from the game. It was like he was a human looking at a bunch of ants scurrying about far beneath him. And in between those ants, there was love and there was hatred. There was life. There was death. There were goodbyes. To Han Sun, they were just small and insignificant things. If Han Sen's Under the Sky mind made him look like a chess piece, then the one he had gained from the Sit and Forget Sutra made him the person who was playing the game of chess. He had jumped off the chessboard. He was now looking down on the fate of all. It wasn't like one of them was right, and one of them was wrong. It was just that his perspective had been altered. Han Sen's Under the Sky mind was about being a part of the world. The Sit and Forget Sutra was looking down at the world from a higher plane. It was only the path that was different. Of course, Han Sen's level was so much lower than the Alpha's had been. The Alpha had reached the end of his trail, but Han Sun had only started his a short while ago. There was no right road, and neither was there a wrong road. But there was a difference between people. Han Sun wanted to reach the same level as the Alpha, but he knew he had a while to go before he could reach such heights. But the Alpha's mind and the Sit and Forget Sutra gave Han Sun a chance to look through the other man's eyes for a bit. It was hard to guess how much of a benefit this would give him. After countless eons, the Sit and Forget Sutra has finally been returned to the Very High. Han Sun, you are the one who did this. And I assure you, you will be handsomely rewarded. When Han Sun looked back, he saw an old man of the Very High. The lanky, bony old man stood in front of Han Sun, looking so happy as he spoke. Exquisite and Li Kier saw the pair standing there, and they were frozen. They quickly turned to Han Sun and said, "Hurry up and thank the ninth uncle." "Thank you, elder." Han Sun bowed. He didn't think that the elder's praise was something to be happy about. At that moment, he didn't have any particular feelings about anything in the world. The ninth uncle wasn't concerned about Han Sen's attitude. The Very High that practiced the Very High sense cared little for manners in their world. The ninth uncle was a butterfly elite, so he wasn't bothered by such petty concerns. The rebirth of the Sit and Forget Sutra shocked the whole of the Very High. Many Very High studied the Sit and Forget Sutra. Li Kier and Exquisite taught it to any who wanted to learn, but most students were disappointed in the results of their studies. The Sit and Forget Sutra's conflict with the Very High sense was too much. Unless their minds reached an Alpha level, they couldn't practice the two Geno arts together. The Alpha called himself the highest Very High beneath the leader. When he had been alive, he had looked through the whole of the Very High race, and failed to find one person with a mind that was the same as his. So no one dared to practice the Sit and Forget Sutra. When they failed to learn from Li Kier and Exquisite, a few of the Very High tried to replicate Han Sen's method by studying the feelings of the ancient wall. However, when they peered into the Very High eye mark, they couldn't trigger the mind inside. Aside from Han Sun, Exquisite, and Li Kier, no one in the Very High could effectively practice the Sit and Forget Sutra. That made many of the Very High feel sad. But Exquisite and Li Kier could practice the Sit and Forget Sutra, at least, and that was very good for the Very High on the whole. They were happy, because Han Sun was the one who had brought the Sit and Forget Sutra back to the Very High. He was given many rewards. When Han Sun received his rewards, he was upset. He thought he would at least be given some deified xenogenic genes, or perhaps some sort of treasure. If he was given a true god item, that would have been great. But instead, the Very High gave him a pass that allowed him to go to the Very High Court. The Very High Court was a treasury that the Very High used to store their Geno arts. When Han Sun received the spell, he gained the privileges of a Very High. He had the authority to enter the Very High Court, and he could practice all sorts of Geno arts there. But to Han Sun, this reward was worse than Geno treasures and xenogenic genes. Exquisite and Li Kier sneered when they noticed Han Sen's thoughts. He had gotten very lucky, but he didn't seem to acknowledge it. Chapter 2746 Buried Dragon. See, now that they had the Sit and Forget Sutra, Li Kier and Exquisite had no more time to follow Han Sun around. The two of them had to relinquish all their other duties and focus on practicing. They needed to take the time to practice the Sit and Forget Sutra now, while their memories were still fresh. Han Sun wasn't keen on focusing on the Sit and Forget Sutra. Although the Geno art was certainly amazing, its style wasn't very suitable for him. Han Sun had learned the Under the Sky mind, and that meant he was walking a road that went against the Sit and Forget Sutra. He wasn't willing to traverse the Sit and Forget Sutra's old path. He only used the Sit and Forget Sutra to finish his Under the Sky. Once he did that, his Under the Sky mind had a breakthrough. Deified xenogeneic gene consumed. Deified gene +1. Evolution progress 1/100. Since he was now unwatched by the two women, Han Sun brought out the deified genes he had hidden. Now that he was deified, he was able to absorb and refine them, allowing their powers to develop and reinforce his body. Over the course of the next few days, Han Sun did little else. Han Sun consumed all of the deified genes that he had saved up. By the end, he had eaten 23 deified genes. Every deified gene boosted the fitness of Han Sun's body. He was now even stronger than he had been before. It looks like the deified rank works the same as the others. If I get 100 deified genes, I can make my body evolve. Luckily, the body of one deified xenogeneic can provide up to 10 deified genes. It shouldn't be difficult to get 100. Outer Sky has many deified xenogeneics roaming about. At this point, why should I wait? Han Sun thought, realizing that there was nothing to stop him from killing deified xenogeneics. He brought out his map of Outer Sky. He researched the deified xenogeneics that were in the vicinity and where he might find them. When he was done, he made the decision to head to the buried Dragon Sea to hunt xenogeneics. Legends claimed that a true god-class dragon had once fallen into the sea. Whether or not that was true was up for debate, but high-class deified xenogeneics rarely appeared near the buried Dragon Sea. That was the main reason that Han Sun decided to go to the buried Dragon Sea. Not many deified xenogeneics were born there, so it would be a safer place than most for Han Sun to hunt. Han Sun had expected to have a difficult time convincing Bauer to stay behind, but he only had to speak one sentence before Bauer was agreeing. To Han Sun's utter astonishment, she didn't insist on going to buried Dragon Sea with him. It caught Han Sun completely off guard. He looked at the six-eared macaque. Its face looked terrible. Its neck was buried between raised shoulders, and it seemed to be trying to hide from everything in sight. Han Sun finally understood. Bauer had found herself a new toy. Han Sun allowed Bauer to look after the star tree while he was gone. After he readied himself, he set out for the buried Dragon Sea. When he reached the outskirts of the sea, he saw people fighting in the distance. When he got a little closer to see what was going on, he saw that it was Princess by way of the Extreme King. Her presence gave him a shock. Upon seeing Han Sun, Bai Wei said nothing. She kept fighting the half-deified flying fish xenogeneic. After she killed the xenogeneic, she remained atop the waves, staring back at Han Sr. Princess Bai Wei. Long time no see. What are you doing all the way out here? Han Sun said with a cough. Bai Wei had been the one who first took Han Sun to the Extreme King. That seemed like a long time ago now. There, Han Sun had murdered Prince Bai Yi and stolen the dead man's identity. For the longest time, he allowed Bai Wei to believe that Bai Yi had killed him instead. On top of that, Han Sun now had a terrible relationship with the Extreme King. It was quite awkward for them to meet now. You can be a very high silkworm, but I cannot, Bai Wei said coldly. Her eyes flickered with some strange emotion. Han Sun suddenly understood. After the last silkworm bout, a few of the silkworms had probably been cast away. Bai Wei must have been one of the replacement silkworms. Han Sun realized that he had no idea what to say. His relationship with Bai Wei was too strange for him to formulate a sentence. They were once allies, but he killed Bai Wei's older brother, and went on to start a very unpleasant feud with the Extreme King. He didn't know where they were supposed to go from here. You are here to kill xenogeneics in the buried Dragon Sea? Bai Wei asked. She seemed to be feeling generous. Yes. Han Sun nodded. If you aren't planning to cause me trouble, then let's go, Bai Wei said. Han Sun was shocked. He hadn't expected Bai Wei to suggest that they go out and kill xenogeneics together. If that's inconvenient for you, then don't worry about it, Bai Wei said when Han Sun didn't respond or make a move. She was ready to move on without him. Why would it not be convenient? Killing xenogeneics with a fair queen would be an absolute pleasure, Han Sun said quickly. Bai Wei had once tried to save Bauer. She had been willing to make great sacrifices to someone she believed to be Bai Yi. Therefore, Han Sun felt as if he owed her one. Call me Bai Wei said. She looked around and said, there aren't many xenogeneics here in the shallow sea. The few that you can find tend to be low level. If you want to kill deified xenogeneics, you are going to have to venture into the deeper recesses of the sea to find them. Let us go to the deep sea then. Han Sun wasn't a very eloquent man, nor was he skilled at small talk. This situation was especially difficult for him, since he felt guilty about what he had put Bai Wei through. He wasn't sure how to relate to her, or what the connection between them was supposed to mean. So they didn't speak as they dove into the deep sea together. The atmosphere was awkward. They encountered some xenogeneics in the sea, and Bai Wei was able to kill them with ease. She had improved a lot. Although she wasn't yet deified, she was half deified. Her performance of the Extreme King's shocking sky punch wasn't bad. After Bai Wei took down a half-deified jellyfish with one punch, Han Sun couldn't help but compliment her. I can't believe I haven't seen you in so long. You have grown so much. Bai Wei gave Han Sun an expressionless glance and said, you were lower level than me, and now you are deified. I'm still just half deified. Do you really think that means I've been developing quickly? Han Sun touched his nose and didn't say anything. The two of them continued to dive deeper. Not long after, they reached the sea bed and found a weird sea creature that was 10 meters long floating above the sand. The creature's body was flat and colored blue. Its tail was akin to a lobster's tail, and pincers curled from the front of its body like a scorpion. 6 claws of various lengths hung from its belly. The xenogeneic looked like a shrimp or a crab. It kind of looked like a scorpion. It was an incredibly strange being, but blue substance chains rose from its body. It was clearly a deified xenogeneic. Without exquisite or liqueur around, Han Sun merely activated his Dongxian Sutra. He could detect that the xenogeneic was a primitive deified, so he moved calmly toward it. Before Han Sun and Bai Wei got close, though the xenogeneic noticed them, it raised its pincers, and its blue substance chain suddenly exploded. A large portion of the sea was painted dark blue, which somehow clouded Han Sun and Bai Wei's 7 senses. They could no longer tell where the xenogeneic was. Han Sun frowned. He was about to use his Dongxian area, but he suddenly saw Bai Wei's body shake. The power that protected her vanished, and she fell down through the water. Han Sun put out his hand and used his power to pull Bai Wei toward him. He picked up her body and saw that her skin looked a bit blue. It was transparent like jade. She'd been hit. Chapter 2747 Battle in the Deep Sea. A substance chain of the poison element? Han Sun looked down at Bai Wei and frowned. Her skin had become transparent and blue, and it seemed as fragile as silk. She looked incredibly weird. The water around Han Sun became dark blue, and the color started to drift straight through the substance chains that protected Han Sen's body. The color was about to touch down on Han Sen's body, like a plume of blue smoke. Han Sen's eyes hardened, and his body transformed into icy jade. He lifted a hand, and an icy jade substance chain suddenly crystallized large portions of the water around him, freezing the toxic substance chains in place. Once the toxic powers had been stopped, Han Sun immediately turned his attention back to Bai Wei and summoned his immortal dragon. Let's see if the immortal dragon's power can fix a body that's been affected by a toxic substance chain. The immortal dragon felt Han Sun's command, and it opened its immortal substance chains. A holy light landed on Bai Wei, causing the blue toxic gas around her to fade. In seconds, her skin had returned to its normal, healthy color. Bai Wei gave Han Sun a strange glance. She didn't speak though, so Han Sun had to ask, "How do you feel?" Bai Wei shook her head and said, "There is no problem. I'm completely fine as a matter of fact." Han Sun felt more secure once he had heard that. He looked at the sphere of blue ice that he had created around them, and then he threw a punch straight at it. When Han Sun first created the ice, his icy power had followed the path of the toxic substance chains as it went. Now as he shattered the ice, The force of his punch followed the frozen substance chains back to their origin. At the end of the long trail of icy shards, a scorpion-like xenogeniac lay unmoving on the sea floor. It was like an icy sculpture. Bai Wei gave Han Sen a glance that was even more inscrutable. Han Sen was just a crystallizer. Despite that fact, and even though far fewer resources had been available to him than to her, Han Sen could freeze a deified xenogeniac in a single punch. That power was super rare, even in the upper echelon of the Extreme King. Elites of the Extreme King could likely never perform such a grand feat against an enemy of the same level. Han Sen walked in front of the frozen deified xenogeniac. His fist blurred down, obliterating the creature's head in a single strike. Under the sheer force of Han Sen's fist, the incredibly resilient armor of the beast was as weak as a wet tissue. Xenogeniac deified killed. Deep blue sea scorpion. Deified xenogeniac gene found. An announcement played in Han Sen's head once the finishing blow was delivered. It looks like deified xenogeniacs aren't that difficult to kill. Once I take down a few more, fulfilling the 100 deified gene requirement will be easy. But this deep blue sea scorpion is too big. If I have to eat its flesh, I will be casting consume for many days, Han Sen thought to himself. Just as he was about to grab the body of the deep blue sea scorpion and drag it away, something burst through the frozen seawater behind the deep blue sea scorpion. An enormous mouth appeared and gulped down the deep blue sea scorpion's body. Oh shit! How dare he steal a kill that I, Han Sen, have earned? Did you eat a bear's heart? Han Sen was so angry. He stared darkly at the xenogeniac that had just swallowed his deep blue sea scorpion. The xenogeniac looked like an electric eel. Its body was snow white, and its scales shone like diamonds. Although it wasn't trying to attack, its body crackled with white lightning that looked like silk as it flickered. After the electric eel swallowed the deep blue sea scorpion, its hunger still wasn't satiated. Its eyes locked on Han Sen, and Bai Wei like a prison spotlight. The next second, the creature exploded with a burst of lightning. A bolt of power flashed toward them, and Han Sen reacted with blinding speed. He generated a substance chain born from jade skin to counter the lightning. Pang! The lightning discharged violently when it slammed into Han Sen's counterattack. Han Sen's hair stood on end as the power swept over him, leaving his clothes charred and pitch black. This guy can't be a transmutation xenogeniac, can it? Han Sen was shocked by the fact that he hadn't completely deflected the lightning's power. He knew this electric eel was far from ordinary. The strike of the electric eel hadn't killed him though. It just sent his body spinning through the blue water. That white lightning was incredibly powerful though. The beast cast another attack, which surged toward Han Sen, and Bai Wei like a net of electricity. Han Sen grabbed Bai Wei and hastily dodged. He also cast the Dongxian Sutra at the same time, and he unsheathed Ghost Teeth Knife. He used Under the Sky to slash at the electric eel. The power that Han Sen could currently emit was enough to defeat an ordinary primitive xenogeniac, but the electric eel's lightning was able to break his offense with ease. Han Sen's brow furrowed as he wondered again what level the electric eel was. Boom! A flash of lightning that looked like it came from space landed on Han Sen didn't have time to dodge it. His whole body crackled with the power, and for a split second it knocked him senseless. His body fell through the water. Bai Wei was in even worse shape, and she only stayed upright because Han Sen was holding her. Her body wasn't as strong as Han Sen's. She was racked with pain, and her electrified armor blackened under the power of the electricity. When Han Sen teleported away with her, the armor couldn't withstand the additional force, and it disintegrated into dust. Arg! When Bai Wei recovered from the lightning's paralysis, she noticed that her armor had turned to dust. She screamed and blushed deeply. Han Sen didn't have time to admire her. He used God's Wander to teleport away from the buried Dragon Sea. They returned to the coast. You stay here for now. That xenogeniac is too strong. I'm not confident that I can kill it, so I need to push my luck solo, Han Sen said. And then he used God's Wander to return to the deep sea. Although he knew the electric eel was extremely strong, it had swallowed his prey. He wasn't going to let that go so easily. The electric eel had lost track of Han Sen and begun to survey the area in an intense search. When it eventually found him, It immediately unleashed a wild burst of lightning. What seemed like an ocean of lightning was now surging toward Han Sr. Han Sen's heart pounded, and a blood-red color swept over his body. It made his skin look like a bloody shell. His body quickly changed, turning him into a half-human, half-demon creature. He looked like some beast that had just crawled out of hell. It was the red blood demon beast's soul. The beast's soul wielded a demonic power, and after Han Sen demonized his body, his strength increased by heaps and bounds. Han Sen also clad himself in his Peacock King's soul robe. The two beast souls appeared on Han Sen at the same time, making Han Sen considerably stronger. He summoned power through Jade Skin again, and threw a punch to meet the incoming storm of electricity. Han Sen's power rushed out, turning everything in front of him into ice. Even the lightning was frozen beneath the sea. It hung in the water, still blazing with light through the ice that encased it. When the electric eel noticed that its lightning had been frozen, it became furious. It opened its mouth and fired out a pillar of lightning like an aurora. Wherever the lightning pillar went, the ice was broken. Nothing seemed capable of stopping the advance of that wicked electricity. Han Sen stared at the pillar of lightning. He mustered his own power, not willing to fall back. He threw a punch forward, aiming directly for that grand force. Boom! The water exploded away as the two powers collided, forming a vacuum zone in the sea. The lightning didn't stop, though, and Han Sen's jadeskin body could do little to stop the lightning that began surging through his body. He was electrified, and he spasmed and shook like he was doing a breakdance. Oh no! There's something strange about this electric eel's lightning, Han Sen thought, his mouth going dry. Ordinary lightning power shouldn't have been able to hit him like that. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.